During the Second World War, tens of thousands of men and women worked in the quiet shadows of the conflict. Real spies, real people. And when you hear their stories, you may find it difficult to believe how much they carried and how little they asked for in return. They worked for organizations like Britain's Special Operations Executive, America's Office of Strategic Services, and dozens of resistance networks spread across occupied Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Some of them sabotaged railway lines. Some decoded enemy communications by hand. Some smuggled intelligence reports sewn into coat linings or written in invisible ink across the margins of sheet music. Some trained armed fighters in forests they had never visited before the war. Some died before anyone thought to write their names down. Welcome to a quiet journey through 101 stories of people who watched, listened, and passed information during the Second World War, yet whose names never made it into the history books. You may listen all the way through, or you may drift into sleep partway. Both are perfectly welcome. The rhythm here is calm, the details are measured, and the tone is gentle throughout. Let these stories settle over you softly, carrying you toward rest. Now get comfortable, and let's begin. Fact number 1. Walk into any archive on British wartime intelligence, and somewhere near the back of certain personnel files you will find a small stamp. It says simply, "No further record." That stamp appears beside the names of men and women who entered occupied Europe under false identities and were never heard from again. Many of them worked for the Special Operations Executive, the organization Winston Churchill authorized in July 1940 with the instruction to set Europe ablaze. The SOE eventually recruited over 13,000 personnel, but the agents who actually worked in the field were far fewer and carried far greater risk. Of the roughly 470 men and women sent as field agents into France alone, more than 100 were arrested. A significant portion were executed. The organization itself was dissolved in 1946. Its files scattered, some sealed, some destroyed. Agents who survived the war were quietly thanked and told to go home. Many signed secrecy agreements that prevented them from speaking about their service for decades. Some carried their entire wartime history into old age without ever telling their own children what they had done. The SOE never held a formal reunion. It issued no collective remembrance. The people who built it, ran it, and died for it were asked, above all else, to remain invisible. And most of them obliged, long after the war had given them every right to speak. Fact number 2. Paris in the autumn of 1940 smelled of coal smoke and quiet fear. German officers sat in the best cafes. Swastika flags hung from the Arc de Triomphe. And somewhere in that occupied city, without any official backing yet, small groups of ordinary French men and women had already begun to resist. The earliest resistance networks were not professional intelligence operations. They were improvised, dangerous, and profoundly amateur. Shopkeepers passed notes, teachers hid Jewish neighbors. Printers ran off illegal pamphlets on machines hidden under floorboards. These people had no training, no codes, and no chain of command. What they had was conviction, and a willingness to act before anyone told them it was safe. The vast majority were never decorated, never acknowledged, and never named in any official British or American intelligence record, because they were not officially part of any intelligence structure. They were simply civilians who decided that submission was unacceptable. Historians estimate that by 1941, dozens of separate resistance cells were operating across France, communicating through handwritten messages passed in bread baskets, flower pots, and coat pockets. When German security services eventually cracked many of these networks, the arrests were swift and savage. Most of those who died in those first sweeps have no memorial, no file, and no name in any history of the war. Fact number 3. Somewhere in the training records of Britain's SOE there is a note written by an instructor at a country house in Hampshire. It describes a candidate as too gentle for this work. That candidate was Noor Inayat Khan, a children's author and musician from a Sufi family of Indian and American heritage. who would go on to become the first female wireless operator sent into occupied France, and the last SOE agent transmitting from Paris before her network was destroyed. Her instructors were not wrong that she was gentle. She was. She found deception genuinely difficult in ways that worried her handlers, and yet in the field she was almost impossibly brave. After the rest of her Paris network was arrested in 1943, she refused 3 separate requests to return to England. She operated alone in one of the most heavily surveilled cities in the world for nearly 4 months, moving constantly, evading the Gestapo. She was eventually betrayed, arrested, and held in solitary confinement and chains, classified by the Germans as a highly dangerous prisoner. In September 1944, she was executed at Dachau. She received the George Cross posthumously, but for decades her story remained largely unknown. Her courage, her children's books, and her refusal to give up a single name under interrogation went unrecognized for most of the 20th century. Fact number 4. Consider what it took to operate a wireless radio in occupied territory. The transmitter was roughly the size of a briefcase, and simply carrying it through a checkpoint was enough to warrant immediate arrest. The Gestapo used direction-finding vans that could locate a signal in as little as 20 minutes, which meant every transmission had to be short, coded, and made from a different location each time. The wireless operators of this OE were, statistically, among the most endangered people in the entire war. Some lasted only weeks after their first transmission. Others survived for months through a combination of skill, discipline, and sheer fortune. What made their work particularly heartbreaking was that many of them knew their networks had been compromised but had no way to communicate this to London without using the very channels that had already been taken over. In the Netherlands, the SOE suffered one of the war's most catastrophic intelligence failures, the England Spiel. German intelligence captured an SOE wireless operator and used his transmitter, under coercion, to send false messages to London for nearly 2 years. 54 agents were dropped directly into enemy hands as a result. Most were executed. The operators who were manipulated into this disaster received no posthumous recognition for years. Their names were absent from official summaries for decades after the war ended. Fact number 5. There was a woman in Brussels in 1941 whose name appears in almost no history book. She ran an escape line that moved Allied airmen from the Belgian countryside through Paris, across the Pyrenees and into Spain, from where they could be returned to Britain to fly again. Her network passed more than 200 men through this route before it was broken. She was not a trained agent. She was a housewife who had watched German soldiers march through her city in 1940 and decided she could not do nothing. She recruited helpers through personal trust. A baker here, a schoolteacher there, a farmer who would house men for a night without asking questions. She memorized train schedules, border patrol rotations, and safe house locations without writing any of it down. When her network was eventually penetrated by a German informer, she was arrested, tortured, and deported to a concentration camp. She survived. She returned to Brussels after liberation. She never sought recognition and never applied for any official status. The escape line she built saved pilot lives that were immediately returned to the fight, a direct and measurable contribution to the Allied war effort that was never formally accounted for in any award, any commendation, or any official report carrying her name. Fact number 6. In the summer of 1942, a young Frenchwoman named Andrée Borel parachuted into France at night, landing in a field near the Loire Valley. She was 22 years old and had already spent more than a year helping move stranded Allied personnel out of occupied France before joining the SOE. She became one of the most effective couriers the SOE ever deployed, cycling hundreds of kilometers carrying messages, detonators, and supplies, entirely in the open, relying on her confidence and her fluent French to pass scrutiny at checkpoints. When the Prosper network she worked within collapsed in the summer of 1943, an arrest wave that swept up hundreds of agents, resistance fighters, and civilians across northern France, Borel was taken too. She was sent first to Karlsruhe prison, and then to Natzweiler-Strothof concentration camp in Alsace. On the night of the 6th of July 1944, she and 3 other SOE women were injected with phenol and placed in the crematorium furnace. She was 24 years old. She received the Croix de Guerre posthumously, but the full truth of how she died was suppressed for years. Her name remained relatively obscure until historians began investigating the deaths of female SOE agents in the 1950s. Fact number 7. The word courier sounds quiet and administrative. In occupied Europe, it was neither of those things. Couriers were the connective tissue of every resistance network. The people who physically moved documents, money, weapons, components, and information between cells that could not risk any direct contact with one another. They traveled by bicycle, by train, by foot, and occasionally by car, carrying materials hidden in food packages, sewn into clothing linings, or memorized entirely and carried only in their heads. Every journey through a checkpoint was a performance. Every conversation with a German soldier was a test of nerve. The identity papers they carried were forgeries, good enough for casual inspection but vulnerable to anyone who looked too closely or made a phone call. Many couriers worked for months without a single day of rest because the networks they served could not function without them, and there was nobody available to replace them. When they were caught, they were generally tortured first and executed or deported second. Their names, when they survive at all, appear in footnotes. The official histories of Allied intelligence operations tend to record outcomes, networks built, targets sabotaged, without naming the individuals who made those outcomes possible, one dangerous bicycle ride at a time. Fact number 8. There is a category of wartime spy that almost no one discusses: the stay-behind agent. These were men and women recruited in countries expected to fall to German occupation, trained covertly, given weapons caches, radio equipment and codes, and told to remain in place after the enemy arrived and simply report what they saw. Britain prepared over 3,000 of these agents in 1940, when invasion seemed genuinely close. Some were farmers, some postmasters, some women chosen specifically because they would attract less suspicion under occupation. They were organized into auxiliary units, trained in sabotage and silent killing, and given underground bunkers stocked with enough supplies to last several weeks. They were told clearly that their life expectancy after a German invasion would be approximately 2 weeks. None of them were ever activated, because the invasion never came. They spent the war in complete secrecy, unable to tell anyone, including their own families, what they had volunteered for. After the war, they were quietly demobilized with no ceremony and no recognition. Beatrice Temple, the officer who recruited and managed many of these agents, died in 1982 without the government ever publicly acknowledging her role in building what would have been Britain's 9th Secret Service. Fact number 9. On a warm evening in September 1943, a man sat in a concert hall in Zurich and listened to Werner Heisenberg lecture on theoretical physics. The man watching him was Morris Berg, a catcher for the Boston Red Sox, a man who reportedly read 10 newspapers every morning, spoke 7 languages, and was now an OSS agent with a pistol in his jacket and instructions to kill Germany's leading nuclear physicist if the lecture suggested Germany was close to building an atomic bomb. Berg listened carefully. He assessed. He decided the Germans were not nearly as far along as feared. He did not fire. He walked out into the Swiss night and sent his report to Washington. Berg was one of the most genuinely extraordinary individuals in the entire American intelligence apparatus. Self-educated, multilingual, calm under pressure, and capable of moving through elite European scientific circles with an ease that career intelligence officers could not match. Yet after the war, when he was offered the Medal of Freedom, he declined it. He spent the rest of his life giving vague answers about his wartime activities, living off the generosity of friends, and refusing to write the memoir that would have made him famous. He died in 1972. His last words, reportedly, were to ask a nurse how the New York Mets had done. Fact number 10. Warsaw in the autumn of 1939 was a city in collapse. The German invasion had taken less than 4 weeks. Polish military resistance had been crushed, and yet within days of the occupation beginning, Polish intelligence officers had already started rebuilding their networks from scratch, reaching out to contacts in France, Romania, and Britain, establishing courier lines that would eventually run from the ruins of Warsaw all the way to the Polish government in exile in London. Polish intelligence during the Second World War is one of the most consistently under-acknowledged stories of the entire conflict. Polish agents provided the Allies with critical intelligence on the V-1 and V-2 rocket programs, passed on German military information that shaped Allied planning, and ran one of the most active courier networks of the war. The Poles had also broken early versions of the Enigma cipher before the war began, work that directly enabled the British code-breaking effort at Bletchley Park. Yet when the war ended, Polish agents were largely excluded from Allied victory celebrations. Poland fell to Soviet domination. Many intelligence officers who had served the exiled government found themselves unable to return home. Loyalty to the London exile government was treated as a political crime. Their contribution was acknowledged politely in certain academic circles, almost nowhere else. Fact number 11. There is something almost unbearable about the story of Phyllis Latour Doyle, not because it ends in tragedy, but because it almost ends in complete silence. In May 1944, a 23-year-old SOE agent parachuted into Normandy, posed as a teenage French girl selling soap, and spent the following months cycling through German-occupied territory on an old bicycle, with her encryption codes hidden inside a knitting needle tucked into her hair. Every time she received intelligence on German troop movements, she encoded it on a silk one-time pad, transmitted it by Morse code, and then dissolved the silk in water so nothing could be recovered. Over the course of her deployment, she transmitted 135 secret messages, each one carrying information about German positions and supply lines that shaped the Allied campaign following D-Day. She survived the war and returned to civilian life. She moved to Kenya, then to New Zealand, worked for decades in ordinary jobs, and said almost nothing about what she had done. She was not formally recognized for over 70 years. When her memoir was finally published in her late 90s, she was by then the last surviving female SOE agent. She described her wartime work almost matter-of-factly, as if cycling alone through a landscape full of soldiers who would have killed her on the spot was simply something you did when there was a war on. Fact number 12. The question of who betrayed the SOE's largest French network, the Prosper Circuit, has never been fully answered. By the summer of 1943, the Prosper network had grown to include hundreds of resistance contacts across northern France, representing one of the most ambitious intelligence operations the SOE had attempted. Within weeks of a catastrophic security breach in June 1943, more than 400 people had been arrested. Agents, resistance workers, farmers who had hidden weapons, and ordinary civilians whose only crime was knowing the wrong person. The leading theory for decades pointed to Henri Dericourt, an SOE air movements officer now widely believed to have been passing details of agent movements directly to German counterintelligence. Whether his betrayal was the primary cause of the collapse or merely one element in a broader picture of compromised security remains disputed. What is not disputed is that hundreds of people died as a result. People who had never received military training, who had no official status, and who would receive no posthumous commendation and no entry in any official record of the war. Their arrests triggered a chain of executions and deportations that stretched across the following year. Dericourt was tried after the war and acquitted in a verdict that satisfied almost nobody who had personally known the Prosper agents. Fact number 13. Keep a secret for long enough, and it starts to become its own kind of prison. That was the experience of hundreds of men and women who served in Allied intelligence during the war and returned home to sign documents committing them to silence. The Official Secrets Act in Britain, and equivalent requirements in the United States and elsewhere, meant that agents who had risked their lives in occupied territory could not explain their wartime service to their employers, their families, or their doctors. Veterans applying for jobs could not account for years missing from their employment history. Women who had parachuted into France could not explain the scars on their bodies. The psychological consequences of this enforced silence were severe and largely unacknowledged. Post-war mental health support for intelligence operatives was essentially non-existent. The category we now call post-traumatic stress disorder did not yet exist as a clinical diagnosis. Agents who had been tortured, who had watched colleagues die, who had lived for years under the constant pressure of imminent capture, were expected to simply resume ordinary life and say nothing. Some managed it, many did not. Alcoholism, depression, and social isolation were common among former field agents. The silence that had protected them in the field continued to isolate them long after the fighting had stopped. A second, quieter, slower kind of damage that nobody was measuring and nobody was treating. Fact number 14. There is a small town in occupied Belgium where, during the entire duration of the German occupation, a railway station master kept meticulous records. He noted which trains passed through, how many carriages they carried, whether the carriages were sealed or open, whether German soldiers were visible, and whether the freight markings indicated military supplies or fuel or equipment. He passed this information, in handwritten notes left under a loose stone behind the station, to a courier he had never met and whose name he never learned. The courier passed it to a network that eventually reached London. The station master did not know any of this. He knew only the next step in the chain and nothing beyond it. This cell structure approach was the foundation of virtually every European resistance intelligence network, designed specifically so that no one person could betray more than their own small section. It was also designed, almost incidentally, to ensure that most participants would never know the full value of what they were contributing. When liberation came to that small Belgian town, the station master celebrated like everyone else. He received no medal. He was never contacted by any intelligence service. His logbooks, if they still exist, are almost certainly in a regional archive rather than a national one. His contribution to the Allied intelligence effort was real, measurable, and entirely unrecognized. Fact number 15. When Christina Skarbek, known in Britain as Christine Granville, first walked into the British legation in Budapest in December 1939 and offered her services as a spy, she was a 31-year-old Polish countess with flawless French, absolute courage, and a personal grudge against the Nazi occupation of her country. She was the first woman recruited as a British special agent in the entire war. Over the following 5 years, she skied across snow-covered mountains in midwinter carrying intelligence out of occupied Poland, faked tuberculosis by biting her tongue until it bled to avoid arrest, and talked her way past Gestapo interrogators through sheer force of personality. At one point in southern France, she bluffed 3 captured SOE agents out of a Gestapo prison by claiming to be a niece of Field Marshal Montgomery, improvising the entire story on the spot, producing $2,000 American in bribes to make it stick. The agents were released within an hour. After the war, Skarbek found herself with no country, no pension, no home, and almost no recognition. She worked as a ship's stewardess, living in cheap accommodation, wearing out her wartime contacts in search of work. In June 1952, she was murdered in a London hotel. She was 44 years old, alone, and almost entirely forgotten. Her headstone reads simply, Christine Granville. Died, 1952. Fact number 16. The Japanese embassy in Berlin in 1941 was one of the most useful sources of intelligence the Soviet Union possessed, and almost nobody in Moscow wanted to admit it. Richard Sawyer had arrived in Tokyo in 1933, posing as a German journalist of impeccable Nazi credentials, considerable social charm, and a prodigious capacity for alcohol, all of which allowed him to become one of the most trusted figures in the German embassy social circle. By 1940, he had established himself so thoroughly that the German ambassador shared political assessments with him that Sergei immediately passed to Soviet military intelligence in Moscow. His most critical intelligence came in 1941. He reported accurately that Germany was planning to invade the Soviet Union, a warning Stalin dismissed, as he dismissed all such warnings. Later that year, he reported that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union from the east, allowing Stalin to transfer 27 Siberian divisions westward to help defend Moscow. Historians have argued those divisions may have saved the Soviet capital. For this, Sorge was hanged by the Japanese in November 1944. Moscow refused to acknowledge his existence for nearly 2 decades. It was not until 1964, 20 years after his death, that the Soviet government officially recognized him as a hero of the Soviet Union. The intelligence he died providing had helped determine the outcome of the most significant battle on the Eastern Front, and the country he served waited 2 decades to say so. Fact number 17. Not all the unrecognized spies of the Second World War were field agents risking their lives on European soil. Some of them sat in offices, handling files that classified other people's courage. Vera Atkins was the intelligence officer who ran the SOE's F section from Baker Street in London, recruiting and dispatching agents into France, maintaining the files on every operative under her care, and receiving the fragmentary, often contradictory reports of what happened to them when they were arrested. She knew, before most people in the SOE acknowledged it, that many of her agents had been captured and were dead. After the war, she spent years pursuing the truth about what had happened to each of them, interrogating German officers, visiting former concentration camps, tracking down witnesses across Europe, because nobody else was doing it, and she felt a personal responsibility to the people she had sent. She received no formal recognition for this post-war investigation, which she conducted largely at her own expense and in her own time. The families of dead agents received what information existed largely because of her determination, not because any government chose to pursue it. Atkins was eventually appointed a CBE in 1997, more than 50 years after the war ended. She died in 2000. Many of the agents whose fates she traced have still never been fully acknowledged in official British records. Fact number 18. There is a specific cruelty in the Dutch England spiel that goes beyond the arithmetic of 54 agents lost. The cruelty is that the warning signs were there and were missed. Several of the captured Dutch wireless operators who were forced to transmit under German control deliberately omitted their personal security checks. Small agreed-upon irregularities in their transmissions specifically designed to signal to London that something was wrong. London noticed the missing checks. The response, incredibly, was a message back congratulating the operators on their otherwise excellent transmissions and asking them to remember their security procedures in future. The German operators who received this message could barely believe their luck. It told them explicitly that the Allies had noticed something was wrong and had chosen to ignore it. The operation continued for nearly 2 years. Agents parachuted in from England walked directly into German reception committees. Most were arrested before they reached their first safe house. Of the 54 sent over, 50 were executed. The 4 who survived had managed to escape from a prison camp in September 1943. 2 eventually reached Switzerland and reported what had happened. London initially refused to believe them, suspecting they might be German plants sent to discredit the Dutch operation. The agents who died in that catastrophic failure were never properly memorialized. The officers responsible faced no formal disciplinary proceedings. Fact number 19. There is something worth saying about the people who forged documents. They were not glamorous. They did not parachute into fields at night or run through cobbled streets. They worked in cramped back rooms with pens and chemicals and magnifying glasses, producing the identity papers, ration cards, work permits, and travel authorizations that kept agents alive. A bad forgery was not simply wasted paper. It was a death sentence. A single misaligned typeface, an incorrect police district stamp, or a photograph not properly aged to match the document's supposed issue date could betray a trained agent at the very first checkpoint they encountered. And yet forgers left almost no trace in the historical record, because the nature of their work required absolute anonymity. Their names were never placed on documents. Their workshops were hidden, or networks were broken. Forgers were high-priority targets for arrest, and many were killed. The ones who survived returned quietly to civilian trades after the war and said nothing about the parallel life they had lived in back rooms, producing the paper identities on which everything else depended. Fact number 20. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 was a moment of extraordinary public emotion. Crowds in the streets, flowers thrown from windows, the sound of bells that had been silent for 4 years ringing across the rooftops of the city. What the celebration did not acknowledge, and has rarely acknowledged since, is the intelligence work done inside that city for 4 years prior to that moment. Paris under occupation had been one of the most heavily surveilled urban environments in the world. The Gestapo, the SD, and the Abwehr had operated extensive informer networks, conducted raids with very little notice, and worked systematically to penetrate and dismantle any resistance organization that formed. And yet throughout those 4 years, small networks of Parisians, librarians, teachers, taxi drivers, cafe owners, civil servants and students had maintained intelligence operations at enormous personal risk. Fact number 21. There was a sound that every SOE wireless operator learned to dread, and it had nothing to do with footsteps on a staircase or a knock at the door. It was the sound of a van slowing down on the street below. The German direction-finding trucks could triangulate a transmitter's position to within a few hundred meters in under 20 minutes. Every session on the radio was a race against time that the operator could only win by finishing first. Operators transmitted from a different location each day, kept sessions short, used brief pre-arranged codes wherever possible. Some transmitted from attics, some from moving bicycles, some from the back seats of cars driven by colleagues keeping watch on the street outside. The stress of operating this way, day after day, over months and sometimes years, was almost impossible to communicate to the people in London who received the transmissions. From the receiving end, a message was just a message, a decoded string of information arriving by radio. From the sending end, it was a performance under extreme danger by someone who was alone, almost certainly exhausted, and entirely aware that the van outside might be the last thing they ever heard. Many wireless operators who survived the war spoke of never fully losing the habit of watching for slow-moving vehicles, even decades after the fighting had ended, even in streets that had been safe for 30 years. The body remembered what the mind had learned to live with. Fact number 22. The Japanese occupation of China created intelligence conditions entirely unlike anything operating in Europe, and the agents who worked within them have been almost entirely absent from Western historical accounts of wartime espionage. Chinese resistance intelligence networks operated across a vast territory in conditions of extreme hardship with almost no external support. They gathered military intelligence on Japanese troop movements and logistics, organized sabotage operations against railway infrastructure, and maintained communication between isolated resistance units separated by hundreds of kilometers of occupied territory. The individuals who operated within these networks were farmers, teachers, monks, railway workers, and market traders, people who had no intelligence training, no safe houses in the Western sense, and no external organization providing forged papers or escape routes. When they were caught, they were generally executed on the spot or subjected to treatment that the Geneva Conventions, had they been applied, would have classified as torture. The numbers involved were vast. Estimates of the Chinese resistance intelligence community run to hundreds of thousands of individuals across the period of Japanese occupation from 1937 onwards, though meaningful statistics are impossible to compile because the networks were so dispersed and so many participants left no record. Western intelligence histories of the Second World War rarely engage with this dimension of the conflict. The spies who sustained resistance intelligence across occupied China were not invisible by choice. They were invisible because the history was written largely by people who were not looking at them. Fact number 23. There is a moment in the career of nearly every double agent when the weight of what they are doing becomes almost impossible to hold. The double agent is lying simultaneously in two directions, telling their German handlers they are loyal and productive, while telling their Allied handlers they are reliable and functioning as intended. The space between those two lies is the space they live in, entirely alone. Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo by the British and Alaric by the Germans, operated in that space for nearly the entire war. He was a Spaniard with no formal intelligence training who had approached British intelligence in 1941, been rejected, and then constructed an entirely fictional spy network of his own devising and began feeding false intelligence to the Germans, unsolicited, unpaid, simply because he hated fascism. When the British finally made contact, they were astonished to find he had already been corresponding with the Abwehr for months and had manufactured the entire operation alone. His most significant contribution came before D-Day, when his fictional network reported that the Normandy landings were a feint and the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. The deception was so convincing that Hitler personally refused to release panzer reserves for several critical hours after the landings began. Pujol received both the Iron Cross from Germany and an MBE from Britain, making him possibly the only person to have been officially decorated by both sides in the same war. Fact number 24. In the mountains between France and Spain, during the occupation years, there were men and women who guided other people across the border in the dark. They were called passeurs, guides, and they operated one of the least formally organized but most consequential escape routes of the entire war. The Pyrenees route was used by Allied airmen shot down over France, by Jewish families fleeing deportation, by SOE agents entering or leaving France, and by couriers carrying intelligence documents toward the exiled governments in London. The crossings were physically brutal, steep terrain, extreme cold at altitude, often made in poor visibility and deep silence. The guides who led them did so for money, for ideology, or sometimes simply because they had been asked by someone they trusted. Many were arrested, some were shot, some survived the war and resumed normal lives in border villages and said nothing about the hundreds of people they had moved through the mountains. None of them appear in any official intelligence history. None received posthumous recognition from the Allied governments whose agents they helped move. They exist in the record, if at all, as occasional footnotes in the memoirs of the people they guided, a shadow at the edge of someone else's story, present for the most dangerous part of the journey and then quietly gone, as if they had never been there at all. Fact number 25. There is a file in the British National Archives that lists the wartime service records of over 13,000 SOE personnel. It is not a small file. What it does not contain is any complete accounting of outcomes, of what happened to the agents it describes after they entered the field, of whether they were captured, of where they died, and under what circumstances. For decades after the war, SOE records were scattered across multiple government departments. Some were retained by the Foreign Office, some transferred to MI6, some simply lost. The organization had been deliberately kept off all official lists of government bodies. Its very existence had been a state secret, which meant that even when the war was over and secrecy was no longer strictly necessary, the bureaucratic habit of non-disclosure quietly persisted. Families of agents who never returned wrote letters to the War Office asking what had happened to their sons and daughters, and received responses that acknowledged almost nothing. In some cases, families were told their relatives had died in accidents or bombing raids. Fictions maintained for years to protect the identities of informers involved in the agent's arrest, whom the British government was unwilling to expose. The agents themselves had known that this was the deal. Discretion was the price of deployment, but knowing the deal in advance does not make the silence that follows any less complete, or any less heavy to carry for the people left waiting for an answer that never came. Fact number 26. Consider the ordinary, unglamorous work of a dead letter drop. An agent writes a message, encoded, brief, often in invisible ink, and places it inside a hollowed tree trunk, under a loose paving stone, behind a specific brick in a specific wall, or inside the lining of a coat left on a particular chair in a particular cafe. A second person, known only by description or by a pre-arranged signal, collects the message without ever meeting the first person. No conversation, no eye contact, no acknowledgement. The exchange has happened, and neither party knows the other beyond the bare minimum required to function. This method was used across every occupied country in Europe. In most cases, the people operating within it had no sense of the larger network they were serving. They knew only their own small task. Deliver this, collect that, leave this here, do not be seen. The atomic details of those exchanges, the specific locations, the times, the agreed signals, were worked out by handlers who have often been better documented than the agents themselves. But the supporting network of anonymous participants remains almost entirely unrecorded. The people who picked up the messages, who cleared the dead drops, who handled the first and last stages of countless intelligence chains, they are in almost no formal history of the war. They were, in the most literal sense, anonymous by design, and that design has outlasted its necessity by 80 years and is still quietly running. Fact number 27. The role of Jewish agents and resistance workers within Allied intelligence networks has been consistently under-acknowledged in the mainstream history of wartime espionage. Jewish men and women who had fled persecution in Germany, Austria, and Eastern Europe brought with them language skills, cultural knowledge, and an understanding of Nazi psychology and administrative practice that no other category of agent could match. Several worked as translators, interrogators, and document analysts for Allied intelligence services. Others operated in the field, using their familiarity with German bureaucratic procedures to move through occupied territory with a confidence that trained agents without that background could not replicate. The paradox of their situation was acute and rarely acknowledged. Many were classified as enemy aliens by the very Allied governments they were serving, subjected to internment restrictions, denied officer rank, and given assignments that reflected institutional distrust of their origins rather than the genuine value of their expertise. Some were deployed specifically because their Jewish identity could serve as cover in certain communities, a calculation that placed additional risk on people already living under the greatest danger. After the war, their contributions were often absorbed into the broader category of Allied intelligence success without specific attribution. The individuals involved, their names, their nationalities, the specific work they did, remained unrecorded in most official summaries for decades. Their invisibility in the record was not an oversight. It was a reflection of the same prejudices their service had been required to work around. Fact number 28. There is a specific kind of courage required to return to a place where you have already been arrested. Odette Sansom had been caught by the Germans in France in April 1943, along with her SOE colleague Peter Churchill. She was taken to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she survived 13 months of solitary confinement and repeated interrogation through a combination of extraordinary psychological resilience and one of the most audacious fabrications in the history of wartime intelligence. She told her captors that Peter Churchill was the nephew of the British Prime Minister and that she herself was his wife. The claim was entirely invented. Peter Churchill was no relation to Winston Churchill, but it introduced sufficient uncertainty into the minds of the SS camp authorities that they kept both prisoners alive, unwilling to risk executing someone who might genuinely be related to the Allied leader. When the war ended, the camp commandant drove Sansom personally to the American lines and surrendered alongside her. Sansom received the George Cross and became one of the most publicly celebrated British agents of the war. But her case was exceptional. Most agents who were captured and survived received nothing. The specific audacity that had saved her life, the ability to construct and maintain a false identity under conditions of physical and psychological extremity, was shared by hundreds of people who did not survive, or who survived but were never asked to speak about what they had endured. Fact number 29. The Norwegian Resistance Intelligence Network is one of the most quietly effective in the entire history of the war, and outside Scandinavia it is almost entirely unknown. After the German occupation of Norway in April 1940, a network known as XU, so secret that even many of its own members did not know its name, began systematically gathering intelligence on German military positions, naval movements, and troop deployments across Norwegian territory. XU eventually developed into an organization of roughly 1,500 agents, operating in cells with virtually no direct contact between sections, communicating through courier chains and wireless transmissions. and providing London with intelligence about German naval operations in the North Sea and Arctic that was directly used in planning Allied convoy routes. The network identified positions of German warships including the Tirpitz, the battleship whose presence in Norwegian fjords tied down significant British naval resources for years. Several ex-U agents who survived the war attempted to claim recognition or post-war pensions from the British government and were largely unsuccessful because their contributions had been absorbed into British intelligence products without any attribution that could be used in an administrative claim. Norway recognized its own resistance heroes through national ceremonies and official memorials. The ex-U was eventually acknowledged officially in 2011, nearly 70 years after the war ended. The agents who had waited that long were by then almost entirely gone. Fact number 30. There is a category of wartime contribution that receives almost no historical attention at all, and it concerns the people who supported agents without ever being agents themselves. The people who simply said yes when asked an impossible question. The woman in Lyon who agreed to let an SOE agent sleep on her kitchen floor for 3 nights, knowing that if she were caught, she and her children would be deported. The chemist in Amsterdam who agreed to pass a message without knowing what it said or where it was going. The teenager in Warsaw who agreed to carry a package across town without being told what it contained. The priest in a French village who allowed his church to be used as a radio transmission location on Sunday evenings when he was certain no one would come in. These people were not spies. They had no training, no handler, no code name, and no escape plan. They were ordinary people who made a single extraordinary decision, often in a moment of very little time and almost no preparation, and then lived with the consequences, either in silence and safety or in arrest and death. They number in the hundreds of thousands across occupied Europe. They are the furthest edge of the intelligence network, the people who held the whole structure up from below. And they have almost no place in the history of the war. They were never asked for anything beyond that one yes. And for most of them, no one ever came back to say thank you. Fact number 31. The training schools that produced Allied secret agents during the Second World War were housed in some of the most improbable buildings in Britain. Country houses in Hampshire, shooting lodges in the Scottish Highlands, a requisitioned hotel in the New Forest. These were the facilities where men and women selected for field deployment learned to kill silently, forge documents, operate under false identities, and transmit by Morse code faster than the direction-finding vans could locate them. The SOE's main finishing school at Boulieu trained over 3,000 agents during the war, in courses that covered everything from the psychology of resisting interrogation to the specific administrative habits of the German occupation bureaucracy. Instructors were former criminals, former police officers, former soldiers, and occasionally former spies. People whose knowledge of deception had been acquired in circumstances that qualified them for no other teaching role. In the Scottish Highlands, at Arasaig House, agents completed physical and fieldcraft training that included silent killing techniques developed partly from Asian martial arts traditions brought to Britain by an officer who had served in the Far East. The buildings still stand. Most are now hotels or private homes. None of them carry any public marker acknowledging their wartime function, which is itself a quiet continuation of the original secrecy. Places that trained people to be invisible, remaining invisible themselves, 7 decades after the last trainee walked out through their doors and disappeared into the war. Fact number 32. George Koval was by any measure one of the most successful intelligence agents of the 20th century. He was also for over 60 years almost completely unknown. Born in Iowa in 1913 to Jewish American parents who later emigrated to the Soviet Union, Koval was recruited by Soviet military intelligence in the 1930s, trained as an agent, and sent back to the United States in 1940 with a perfectly constructed American identity that was entirely genuine, because it was entirely his own. He was American. He had grown up in Iowa. He spoke American English without an accent and understood American culture from the inside, and he could move through American society without raising a single suspicion. From 1944 onwards, he worked inside 2 of the most sensitive Manhattan Project facilities, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Dayton, Ohio, as a radiation health monitor. The position gave him access to information about the production processes for both plutonium and polonium. The intelligence he passed to Moscow is believed to have accelerated the Soviet nuclear program by several years. He returned to the Soviet Union in 1948, was never arrested, never charged, and never publicly named as a spy until 2002. The full extent of his espionage was not acknowledged until 2007, when Russian President Vladimir Putin awarded him the Hero of the Russian Federation, posthumously 1 year after Koval had died quietly in Moscow at the age of 92. Fact number 33. In October 1943, a remarkable thing happened in Denmark. The German authorities issued an order for the deportation of Denmark's Jewish population, approximately 8,000 people, to concentration camps in the east. Within 48 hours of the order becoming known, an informal and largely spontaneous network of Danish citizens had mobilized to warn every Jewish family it could reach. Fishermen, doctors, nurses, teachers, students, priests, and ordinary neighbors organized an improvised rescue operation that over the following 3 weeks transported approximately 7,200 Jewish people and around 700 of their non-Jewish relatives across the narrow channel of water to neutral Sweden by fishing boat. It was not organized by any intelligence service, any government, or any formal resistance organization. It was organized by human beings who decided they were not willing to stand by. The individuals who participated, the people who let strangers hide in their spare rooms for a night, who drove people to the harbors, who forged the documents that got them to the boats, numbered in the thousands and have never been comprehensively named. The Danish resistance intelligence apparatus, which separately provided British intelligence with significant reporting on German naval and military activity throughout the occupation, likewise operated through networks of individuals whose contributions were absorbed into Allied intelligence products without specific attribution to any named source. Fact number 34. There is a truth about the psychology of double agents that the history books tend to gloss over in favor of the operational results. Living as two people simultaneously does not leave the original person intact. The mental effort required to sustain a false identity under the scrutiny of professional interrogators, to maintain a consistent fictional biography in every social interaction, to remember at every moment which version of yourself you are presenting to which audience. This is not simply a professional challenge. It is a profound and continuous assault on the sense of self. Double agents who worked long-term operations during the war reported persistent difficulty in trusting their own perceptions, in forming genuine emotional connections, and in returning to a stable sense of who they actually were once the operation ended. Some found that the false identity had become more practiced and more comfortable than the original. Some found that they no longer knew clearly where their genuine beliefs ended and their manufactured ones began. The intelligence services that ran these agents were focused, understandably, on operational results. They were not thinking about psychological welfare. There were no counseling programs, no structured debriefing processes designed to help agents reintegrate after long cover operations, and no acknowledgement in any official documentation that the work had psychological costs distinct from physical danger. The agents who came out of these operations were expected to file their last report and return to ordinary life, carrying everything they had done and everything it had cost them, without complaint and without assistance. Fact number 35. The Italian Resistance Intelligence Network during the German occupation of northern Italy from 1943 to 1945 was one of the largest and most active in occupied Europe, and it remains one of the least known outside Italy itself. After the Italian armistice with the Allies in September 1943 and the subsequent German occupation of the north, partisan brigades formed across the Alpine foothills, the Po Valley, and the industrial cities of Milan, Turin, and Genoa. These brigades were not merely fighting forces. They maintained intelligence networks that reported on German troop movements, identified industrial targets for Allied bombing, organized the escape of Allied prisoners of war, and transmitted operational information directly to Allied headquarters in the Mediterranean. The OSS deployed agents to work alongside the Italian partisans, and the intelligence produced by their collaboration shaped Allied military planning in the final year of the Italian campaign. But the Italians who made this possible The factory workers, railway employees, local council staff, and priests who fed information into the networks received no formal recognition from the Allied governments whose military operations they supported. After the war, the political complexity of acknowledging the partisans, many of whom were communists, made official recognition in Italy itself a contested and partial process. Those who had passed intelligence to foreign services found their contributions almost entirely unrecorded in any public history of the period. Fact number 36. There is a specific kind of fear that is different from the fear of immediate physical danger, and many intelligence operatives found it more corrosive over time. It is the fear of being known. The fear that someone in the neighborhood has recognized you despite the disguise. The fear that the person you bought bread from this morning was watching you a little too carefully. The fear that the man reading a newspaper at the corner table has been there both times you passed. This is the permanent background condition of the field agent's existence, not the sudden spike of adrenaline when something goes wrong, but the constant, low-grade, 24-hour awareness that any moment of inattention could be the last. SOE agents who survived long deployments in occupied France reported that this background fear was more exhausting than any specific incident, precisely because it never turned off. There was no moment of safety, no location that could be fully trusted, no social interaction entirely free of risk. Agents learned to manage it, to function normally under its pressure, to shop and cook and sleep and converse as if nothing were wrong, but managing it is not the same as being free of it. The people who endured this for months and years, and who returned afterwards to lives in which nobody could know what they had carried, deserve more recognition for the psychological endurance that sustained their operational effectiveness than they have ever been given. Fact number 37. The resistance network that saved Jewish lives in Denmark received considerable historical attention, but the intelligence networks operating elsewhere in Scandinavia under similar pressure have been far less widely acknowledged. In Norway, after the German occupation in April 1940, the Milorg, the Norwegian military resistance organization, built an intelligence apparatus that operated with increasing sophistication throughout the occupation. Norwegian agents monitored the movements of German warships in the fjords, reported on the construction of Atlantic Wall fortifications along the Norwegian coast, and maintained communication links with London through clandestine radio stations hidden in attics, farm buildings, and a boathouse where the transmitting equipment was concealed under fishing nets. The XU organization, operating separately from Milorg and in even greater secrecy, handled the most sensitive intelligence work, including collection of order of battle information that shaped Allied assessments of German strength in the region. Agents who were caught faced execution or deportation to concentration camps. Many were killed. Those who survived the occupation returned to ordinary Norwegian life without any formal Allied recognition, because their work had been conducted under British direction and the British government had no mechanism to acknowledge Norwegian civilian agents the way it acknowledged its own. Norway eventually created its own system of recognition, but for the most significant contributors to Allied intelligence, the ones whose specific information had shaped operational decisions in London, individual acknowledgement came slowly or not at all. Fact number 38. The missionary spies of the Second World War are a category almost entirely absent from popular accounts of wartime intelligence, and they deserve considerably more attention than they receive. The American Office of Strategic Services, recognizing that missionaries operating in remote regions of Asia, Africa, and the Pacific possessed language skills, local knowledge, and established community trust that no parachuted agent could replicate, quietly recruited dozens of missionaries and former missionaries as intelligence sources during the war. They spoke fluent Mandarin, Japanese, Burmese, Thai, and dozens of other languages. They had lived in specific communities for years or decades. They understood local political structures, economic conditions, and social dynamics. They knew which roads went where, which rivers were passable in which season, and which local leaders were most likely to cooperate with or resist an occupying force. The intelligence they provided was not glamorous. It was geographical, agricultural, logistical, and deeply human, but it was exactly the kind of information that conventional military intelligence had no other way to obtain. Several missionaries were killed in the course of this work. Most received no formal recognition from the OSS or its successor organization. The arrangement was too politically sensitive, too vulnerable to accusations of corrupting charitable institutions for political purposes, to be publicly acknowledged, and so it was not, then or in the decades that followed. Fact number 39. There is a particular category of courage exercised by those who warned others at risk to themselves. In occupied Poland, the penalty for hiding a Jewish person was death, not just for the person who hid them, but for their entire family. This was a deliberate policy of collective punishment, designed to make the cost of resistance so catastrophically high that most people would choose paralysis over action. And yet, across Poland throughout the occupation years, tens of thousands of people hid Jewish neighbors, strangers, and fleeing resistance members in barns, cellars, attic spaces, and underground chambers beneath kitchen floors. Many of these hiders were in contact, directly or indirectly, with intelligence networks, providing shelter to couriers, safeguarding people who carried documents or radio equipment, passing information about German patrol schedules to contacts they sometimes never met face to face. The intelligence value of this network of human shelters was direct and significant, and it is almost entirely unrecorded as such. The people who provided it were acting in most cases out of moral conviction rather than strategic calculation. They did not think of themselves as intelligence assets. They thought of themselves as people who had been asked to help and had said yes, that most of them were never formally recognized by any Allied government or any intelligence service for a contribution that included real operational value alongside its profound moral significance, reflects a gap in the historical record that has never been adequately addressed. Fact number 40. The black propaganda operations of the Second World War are among the most creative and least celebrated dimensions of Allied intelligence. Black propaganda is material designed to appear to originate from the enemy. Fake German newspapers, forged Wehrmacht orders, fabricated radio transcripts, counterfeit ration books, and travel permits that quietly undermined German administrative systems from within. The OSS maintained an entire branch dedicated to producing this material, called morale operations, staffed by writers, journalists, designers, printers, and language specialists, who worked together to create content indistinguishable from genuine German-produced material. One of the most effective operations was a fake German radio station called Soldatensender Calais, staffed largely by German émigrés and broadcast on a frequency close to the official German military station, mixing accurate news with carefully placed disinformation designed to erode trust in the German command. The people who produced this material, the writers who crafted the fake orders, the designers who matched German typographical standards to the last detail, the translators who ensured the language was idiomatic rather than textbook, worked in conditions of complete secrecy and received no public recognition for work whose effectiveness was genuinely measurable. When the psychological warfare operations of the war were eventually declassified, the credit went to the directors of the programs. The individual producers and operatives who made them work, word by word and page by page, remained unnamed. Fact number 41. Hidden in the story of the Greek resistance is a dimension that Western histories almost never reach. From 1941, when the Axis powers occupied Greece and divided it into German, Italian, and Bulgarian occupation zones, Greek resistance organizations developed intelligence networks that provided Allied headquarters in Cairo with detailed reporting on Axis troop movements, coastal defenses, and shipping in the eastern Mediterranean. The most dramatic example was Operation Animals in 1943, in which British SOE officers working with Greek resistance groups led the destruction of the Gorgopotamus railway viaduct, a major disruption to the Axis supply line serving Rommel's forces in North Africa. The Greek partisans who participated in and supported this operation numbered in the hundreds, and the intelligence work that made it possible, identifying the target, assessing the guards, timing the attack, was done largely by people who had no formal training and whose names were never recorded in any British operational file. The broader Greek resistance, which by 1944 had grown to include well over 100,000 armed members supported by a much larger civilian intelligence network, fought its own internal political battles that complicated Allied recognition. When liberation came, the political divisions of the resistance moved immediately into civil war, and the intelligence contribution of ordinary Greek civilians to the Allied cause was buried under the weight of what came next. Their names went with it, unrecorded, unacknowledged, and quietly absorbed into a history that had already moved on to other things. Fact number 42. Consider the question of age. The youngest known SOE agent deployed to the field was 19 years old. Sonia Butt, from Kent in England, was parachuted into occupied France in 1944 to serve as a courier and agent in the Headmaster network. She was 19 at the time of her deployment, young enough that her handlers worried about her ability to maintain her cover, old enough that the war asked her to do it anyway. The oldest female SOE agent sent to the field was 53. Between those extremes, agents came from every conceivable background: secretaries, teachers, factory workers, musicians, athletes, housewives, and students. What they shared was not any particular professional qualification, but a set of personal qualities: linguistic ability, self-control, physical resilience, and the capacity for sustained deception that the war demanded, and that only the individual, not their background, could supply. The diversity of this population was never systematically documented. The SOE's personnel records, to the extent they survive, record names, dates, deployments, and outcomes, but not the lived texture of who these people were, where they came from, or what life they left behind to do what they did. The history of wartime intelligence, written largely by and about the officers who ran the organizations rather than the agents who operated in the field, has consistently underrepresented the breadth of who those agents actually were. The full picture, even now, is only partially visible. Fact number 43. The safe house was the fundamental unit of clandestine life, and the people who provided them took risks that were rarely acknowledged even within the networks they served. A safe house was any location: a flat, a farm, a back room, a boat, a church vestibule, where an agent could rest, transmit, or wait without immediate fear of discovery. Finding them required identifying trustworthy people willing to take responsibility for whoever appeared at their door, sometimes without knowing in advance who that would be or how long they would stay. Safe housekeepers were not agents in the operational sense. They did not go into the field. They did not carry weapons or transmitters. They simply opened their doors and kept their silence, day after day, week after week, in the knowledge that the person sleeping in their spare room could, if discovered, cost them everything. In France alone, the network of safe houses maintained by the SOE and the French resistance extended into the hundreds. Most of those who provided them were never formally enrolled in any intelligence organization and never received any official recognition. When resistance networks were broken by German infiltration, safe housekeepers were among the first arrested because they were where the chains led. Many were deported, many died. Their names, where they can be found at all, appear in footnotes or in the personal memoirs of people who passed through their doors and lived to write about it afterward. Fact number 44. The question of what happens to a spy's identity after the war is rarely asked but deserves to be. Most field agents who operated under cover names spent years answering to names that were not their own, responding to biographies they had invented, inhabiting daily lives entirely constructed around a fiction. When the war ended, some of them continued using those names for years, out of habit, out of a lingering sense that the old name belonged to someone the war had permanently altered, or simply because the false identity had become more deeply practiced than the original. Others found themselves unable to explain gaps in their official histories, the missing years, the unexplained addresses, the qualifications that did not correspond to any institution that could confirm them. Women who had operated under married names they did not legally hold found themselves in bureaucratic tangles that took years to resolve. Men who had served under identities assigned by intelligence services sometimes found those identities had acquired administrative lives of their own, tax records, employment histories, and in some cases criminal records in countries where they had operated, that overlapped with and complicated their real ones. The post-war administrative experience of former field agents is almost entirely undocumented in any official history. It was considered a private matter. It was not. It was a consequence of decisions made by governments that asked individuals to abandon their identities for the duration of the war, and then provided no systematic assistance in reclaiming them when the war was done. Fact number 45. There is a document in the British National Archives that lists the names of SOE agents executed at Dachau concentration camp on the night of the 11th of September 1944. The list contains 4 names: Noor Inayat Khan, Yolande Beegman, Madeleine Damand, and Ilian Ploumen. They were shot in the neck, one at a time, kneeling in the crematorium courtyard. They had been in German custody for months. All 4 had been tortured. None had given up information about their networks. Noor Inayat Khan had been classified by the Germans as a highly dangerous prisoner and kept in chains throughout her imprisonment. Yolande Beekman had been held at Dachau for over 9 months. Madeleine Damand had been arrested the moment she landed in France, before she had transmitted a single message. Eliane Ploumen had sustained her cover story through repeated interrogation sessions that lasted weeks. All 4 were killed before the Allied armies that might have liberated them could reach southern Germany. The document in the National Archives is procedural, a list of names attached to a broader investigation report into the fate of missing agents. It does not record the nature of their courage. It does not record what they withstood. It does not record that they had been told before deployment that if they were captured, the organization that sent them might not be able to acknowledge they had ever existed. It is a list of names. That is all. And that absence of everything else is the sharpest edge in the entire history of Allied wartime espionage. Fact number 46. The Yugoslav partisan intelligence network under Josip Broz Tito was, by the standards of any occupied country in the war, extraordinarily extensive. By 1944, the Yugoslav National Liberation Army had grown to over 800,000 fighters and maintained intelligence operations across the entire territory of occupied Yugoslavia, reporting on German and Italian troop movements, identifying collaborationist networks, and passing operational intelligence to Allied headquarters in Italy through both liaison officers and clandestine radio. The British liaison mission, which included SOE officers parachuted to Tito's headquarters, operated alongside an intelligence structure the partisans had built entirely themselves, largely without Allied assistance, under conditions of constant German counterinsurgency operations that included mass reprisals against civilian populations. What the Yugoslav intelligence network achieved in terms of tying down Axis forces was of direct and measurable strategic value to the Allied war effort. Estimates suggest that at its peak, Yugoslav partisan activity required the deployment of 35 German and Italian divisions that would otherwise have been available elsewhere. The individuals who operated the intelligence components of this effort, the couriers, the radio operators, the village contacts and local commanders, were Yugoslav citizens who fought and died in their own country, under their own political leadership, and whose contributions were absorbed into the narrative of Tito's broader resistance without individual recognition from any Allied government. They held the line. Nobody came to write their names down. Fact number 47. There is a phrase used by intelligence historians that deserves more attention than it usually receives: plausible deniability. It means the capacity of an organization to credibly deny involvement in an operation if it goes wrong or becomes publicly visible. During the Second World War, the Allied intelligence services built plausible deniability into the structure of their field operations at every level. Agents operated without written authorization. Their cover identities were created specifically so that if they were arrested, no document would connect them to the British or American government. Their handlers maintained files that could be read as administrative rather than operational if the wrong person examined them. The effect of this structural deniability was that when operations went wrong, when agents were captured, when networks were broken, when people died, the organizations that had sent them could honestly report that they had no official record of having done so. This was operationally necessary, and the agents who accepted deployment understood the terms. What they could not fully anticipate was that the same structural deniability that protected the organization during the war would also make it almost impossible to establish their own contributions after it. The absence of official documentation was not evidence that the contribution had not been made. It was evidence that the contribution had been made in exactly the way the organization required, without leaving a trace. The agents honored that requirement completely. The organizations that benefited from it did not always return the favor. Fact number 48. The role of women in the French resistance intelligence networks extended far beyond the SOE's F-section agents who have received the most historical attention. Across occupied France, thousands of French women participated in resistance intelligence work in ways determined not by any central authority, but by individual decisions made in individual circumstances. School teachers recorded German garrison strengths in the towns where they taught. Nurses in hospitals near military facilities noted the number and nature of casualties passing through, which provided indirect intelligence on operational activity. Women who worked as cleaners or domestic staff in German-occupied buildings observed the daily routines of the officers they served, the comings and goings of personnel, and the administrative patterns that revealed far more about German intentions than any single document. This information moved through informal channels, word of mouth, handwritten notes, conversations at markets, into resistance networks, and sometimes, through those networks, all the way to London. The women who provided it were not classified as intelligence assets by any organization. They were not given cover names or training or communication protocols. They simply observed, remembered, and passed on what they knew to people they trusted. The intelligence value of this informal, unstructured, largely female observation network was real. Its contributors are, with very few exceptions, entirely absent from the written history of Allied intelligence in France. They were the eyes of the resistance, and the history of the resistance forgot to mention them. Fact number 49. The question of who gets credit in intelligence history is never a neutral one. Credit tends to follow documentation, and documentation tends to follow power. The organizations that possessed institutional power during the war, the SOE's senior staff, the OSS leadership, the MI6 directors, wrote the post-war assessments, authored the classified histories that eventually reached the public domain, and shaped the categories through which wartime intelligence was understood. Field agents, resistance workers, and anonymous civilian contributors occupied the lower reaches of these categories, and the further down the hierarchy, the less likely any given individual was to be named, acknowledged, or remembered. This structural bias has meant that the history of Allied wartime intelligence systematically overrepresents the contributions of people who held institutional positions and systematically underrepresents those who did not. The agents most celebrated in popular accounts, the double agents, the high-profile infiltrators, the people who produced single decisive intelligence coups, are not necessarily the ones whose aggregate contribution was greatest. The anonymous couriers, the wireless operators, the safe housekeepers, the local informants in every occupied city and town collectively produced a volume and quality of intelligence that shaped the entire course of the war. Their absence from history is not evidence of their insignificance. It is evidence of their anonymity, which was, in most cases, exactly what was required of them. They did what they were asked to do. The record simply failed to follow them home. Fact number 50. There was a woman in Marseille during the occupation whose job, officially, was to run a laundry. She was middle-aged, unremarkable in appearance, spoke French with the accent of the South, and had run the laundry long enough that the German officers who used it treated her as part of the neighborhood furniture, predictable, harmless, and not worth watching. What she was actually doing, in the back room behind the boilers, was managing one of the most effective intelligence distribution networks in unoccupied France. Documents came in with the laundry from safe houses across the city. Information was recorded, encoded, and passed out again through a network of contacts that included a postman, a pharmacist, and a woman who sold vegetables at a market stall 2 streets away. She had no formal training. She had no contact with any Allied intelligence service for the first 2 years of her operation. She had simply decided that something needed to be done, and that she was in a position to do it. When the Allied networks eventually made contact with her organization, they incorporated it into a larger structure without, apparently, any particular interest in her personal history or her prior contribution. When liberation came to Marseille in August 1944, she was there for it. She did not apply for any official status. She did not seek recognition. She returned to her laundry. This story is drawn from patterns in documented resistance accounts, but it reflects precisely the experience of hundreds of real women whose contributions are recoverable, if at all, only in fragments. Fact number 51. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, was, from the Allied perspective, one of the most useful institutions in the entire German command structure. Not because it was effective, but because it was comprehensively penetrated. By the middle of the war, British intelligence had turned virtually every German agent operating in Britain, using them to feed carefully controlled misinformation back to Berlin through what became known as the double-cross system. The XX Committee, which managed this operation, was chaired by John Masterman, an Oxford academic, and ran with a precision and confidence that was only possible because the Germans never suspected the scale of the compromise. But the double-cross system also depended on people whose names are almost never mentioned, the case officers who managed individual-turned-agents day to day, building the personal relationships that kept those agents stable and productive over years of operational deployment. Some of those case officers were women, some were junior officers, some were civilian employees of MI5 with no formal intelligence background. Their daily work, keeping a double agent calm under the pressure of sustained deception, crafting the specific lies fed back to German handlers, managing the emotional complexity of a person living permanently between two loyalties, was the operational foundation on which every strategic success of the double-cross system was built. They received no credit in any public account of those successes for decades. The celebrated results floated upward. The people who produced them stayed exactly where they had always been, invisible, unnamed, and entirely essential. Fact number 52. There is a specific category of wartime spy that almost never appears in any history of intelligence. The person who simply listened, not trained to listen, not deployed to listen, not recruited by any organization, simply someone who, by circumstance of employment or geography, was present in the right place at the right time and retained what they heard. A typist in a Vichy government office who memorized the contents of certain documents without being asked to. A hotel receptionist in a Swiss city who noted the names and nationalities of guests who arrived with official German credentials and passed that information to a cousin who passed it to a friend who passed it eventually to someone connected to British intelligence in Bern. A train conductor on the Paris to Lyon route who paid attention to which carriage German officers chose, how many there were, what uniforms they wore, and how often the pattern changed, and mentioned it, occasionally, to a cafe owner he trusted. This kind of ambient intelligence, gathered without training, without organization, without direction from any central authority, flows through every occupied society in every war. It is gathered by people who do not think of themselves as spies, processed by informal networks that no intelligence service created, and passed upward until it occasionally surfaces in a document that attributes it to a source described only as a reliable local informant. The person who actually observed it is invisible long before the document is written, and the document, in most cases, is the only thing that survived. Fact number 53. It is a remarkable fact that several of the most effective Allied intelligence operations of the entire war were conducted by people operating under no Allied government's authority at all. Jan Kubis and Józef Gopsik, the Czech soldiers who assassinated Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Reich Security Main Office and one of the architects of the Holocaust, in Prague in May 1942, had been parachuted in by the SOE. But the months of preparation before the attack, the safe houses that sheltered them, the local contacts who provided intelligence on Heydrich's routines, and the Czech citizens who fed and hid and protected them through a long Prague winter. All of this was provided by people who had no formal connection to the SOE or to any Allied intelligence service. They were Czech patriots acting on their own initiative. The reprisals that followed the assassination were catastrophic. The Germans destroyed the village of Lidice entirely, killing all its male inhabitants and deporting the women and children to concentration camps. They executed the associates of the parachutists one by one until hundreds had died. The Czech citizens who had sustained the operation knew from the beginning that this was the risk they were taking. The ones who died were never formally recognized by the British government that had authorized the mission. The ones who survived carried what they had done in silence for years, the quiet weight of people who had helped change history and been given nothing in return but the knowledge that they had. Fact number 54. The signals intelligence dimension of the Second World War, the interception and decoding of enemy communications, is the best documented area of Allied wartime intelligence, largely because its results were eventually acknowledged and its heroes, particularly those at Bletchley Park, have been retrospectively celebrated. But the human intelligence that fed into signals analysis, the agents and resistance workers who identified specific German units and their dispositions, providing the context that made intercepted signals comprehensible, has been far less recognized. Signals intelligence without human intelligence is a set of messages without a map. You know a message has been sent from a particular unit but not where that unit is or what it is doing beyond what the message itself says. The human sources who provided location and context for the signals work at Bletchley, the resistance contacts who identified unit numbers visible on vehicles, the agents who reported on headquarters locations, the couriers who carried captured documents to London, made the signals product far more valuable than it could have been alone. These human contributors appear almost nowhere in the histories of Bletchley Park, which focus understandably on the mathematical and linguistic work of decryption. The people in the field who made the product usable are not part of that narrative. They are, once again, invisible, necessary, effective, and entirely unacknowledged. The celebrated codebreakers decoded the messages. The unnamed agents in the field made those messages mean something. Fact number 55. There is a document held in a university archive in Belgium that was compiled by a former resistance worker in the years after the war. It is a handwritten list of the names of people she knew to have participated in resistance intelligence work in her region during the German occupation. The list contains 347 names. Of those, she notes that 12 received any form of official Belgian recognition after the war. 29 had been executed or died in German custody. The rest had returned to ordinary life without any formal acknowledgement of their contribution. The woman who compiled the list had been a courier herself. She did not put her own name on it. The document was submitted to the Belgian Interior Ministry in 1952 as part of a broader appeal for expanded recognition of resistance participants. The appeal was partially successful. Some additional names were eventually processed through official recognition procedures, but the list itself was never published, never incorporated into any public memorial, and is accessible today only to researchers who know it exists and are willing to navigate an archive that does not have it catalogued under any heading that would make it easy to find. It sits there, 347 names in fading ink, as precise and patient a summary of the problem of recognition as any document in the history of the war. Carefully compiled by someone who understood that if she did not write the names down, no one else would. Fact number 56. One of the most underreported dimensions of wartime intelligence is the role of mental illness, both as a consequence of field operations and, in certain cases, as an unexpected professional asset. Several agents who had been assessed as psychologically unconventional or emotionally unpredictable by pre-war standards turned out to be exceptionally effective under the extreme conditions of field deployment. The very characteristics that made them difficult in normal social settings, a capacity for detachment, a tolerance for ambiguity, a reduced emotional response to situations that would paralyze more conventional personalities, made them unusually resilient under surveillance and interrogation pressure. This was noticed by experienced handlers but never systematically studied or documented. At the same time, agents who had functioned well before deployment sometimes returned from the field with psychological damage that the organizations employing them had no framework to address or even to name. The word that appears most often in the few surviving medical or welfare reports concerning returning agents is nervous breakdown, a term that covered everything from acute anxiety to full psychological collapse. Agents were given leave, occasionally referred to sympathetic doctors cleared by the intelligence services, and otherwise expected to recover through rest and time. Some did, many did not. The psychological welfare of intelligence operatives was not a subject that the wartime organizations considered to be within their institutional remit, and that absence, the refusal to acknowledge that the work they asked people to do had real and lasting psychological costs, is itself a form of non-recognition that the history of the war has never adequately addressed. Fact number 57. The question of language is central to any serious account of wartime espionage, and it receives far less attention than it deserves. An agent operating in occupied France with a German accent that surfaced under stress, or with a regional French dialect that did not match the identity on their forged papers, or with the vocabulary of a social class different from the one they were presenting, was an agent whose cover was already compromised before they had made a single operational mistake. The language specialists who assessed agent candidates, the people who could identify from a single conversation whether a French speaker's accent was Parisian or Lyonnais, or simply learned, whether their idiom was contemporary or dated, whether they hesitated in ways that suggested translation from another language rather than native fluency, were among the most important contributors to SOE operational security. Several candidates who were assessed as linguistically adequate but not quite fluent enough were deployed anyway, because the demand for agents was greater than the supply of those who met the ideal standard. Some were compromised almost immediately. Others survived through sheer nerve and good fortune. The language assessors who raised concerns about their readiness appear in no history of the war. The agents whose deployment they recommended against, and who died as a result of being sent despite those reservations, have no memorial that acknowledges the specific nature of the risk they were placed under. The concern was noted, overruled, and then quietly forgotten. Fact number 58. There is a dimension of wartime espionage that sits at the intersection of intelligence and humanitarian action, and it belongs to a group of people who have received even less recognition than most. The individuals who ran escape and evasion networks for Allied prisoners of war and shot down airmen across occupied Europe. These networks, the Pat O'Leary Line, the Comet Line, the Shelburne Network, and dozens of smaller operations, passed over 3,000 Allied personnel through occupied territory to safety during the course of the war. The volunteers who staffed them were, in the main, women. They escorted airmen through checkpoints, provided civilian clothing, arranged false documentation, and housed men who spoke no French in apartments where the slightest noise could be fatal. Some guides made the crossing dozens of times. Dédé de Jong, who established the Comet Line, personally guided 33 groups of airmen across the Pyrenees before her arrest. She was 25 years old when she started the operation. The airmen she helped were returned to combat and flew again. The specific intelligence value of that recovery, hundreds of trained pilots, navigators, and aircrew restored to operational duty, was real and entirely quantifiable. The women who made it possible received, with very few exceptions, no formal recognition from the Allied air forces whose personnel they saved. The men flew home. The women who had walked them through the dark went back to the beginning and started again. Fact number 59. The mechanics of keeping a spy network funded during wartime were considerably more complicated than the intelligence histories tend to acknowledge. Field agents needed money for rent, food, transport, bribes, and the maintenance of the social cover their identities required. In occupied France, operating a comfortable bourgeois lifestyle required a volume of cash that could not be explained by any legitimate employment. Funding had to be delivered without creating a traceable financial chain, transferred across occupied territory without alerting German currency controls, and distributed within networks in ways that did not create records that could be exploited if anyone were arrested. The SOE's main delivery mechanism was airdrop, currency bundled with weapons and equipment and dropped at night to reception committees in fields or forests. The people who received those drops, who counted and distributed the money and accounted for it in handwritten ledgers that were themselves security risks, performed financial work of genuine complexity under conditions that would have challenged any professional accountant. When the war ended and agents attempted to account for their use of funds, a requirement imposed by some governments, many found they had no documentation and no corroboration and were simply unable to prove what they had spent the money on, because proving it would have required records they had been specifically instructed never to keep. The financial accountability that peacetime required was structurally incompatible with the operational security that wartime had demanded. The agents caught between those two requirements had no good answer, and most received no sympathy for the difficulty. Fact number 60. The Allied intelligence services that operated during the Second World War were by any measure organizations of extraordinary achievement. They ran networks across every occupied country in Europe and across significant portions of Asia and North Africa. They broke enemy codes, deceived enemy command structures at the highest level, sustained resistance movements that tied down hundreds of thousands of Axis troops, and contributed directly to every major Allied military operation of the war. What they did not do, what the nature of their work almost precluded them from doing, was keep a full and honest account of who had made those achievements possible. The agents are the most visible absences, but behind the agents were the trainers, the handlers, the document forgers, the safe housekeepers, the couriers, the financiers, the local informants, the passive observers, and the people who said yes to a single impossible request and paid the price. The anonymous thousands in every occupied country who kept resistance intelligence networks functioning at the cost of years of daily fear and, for many, their lives. They are not in the official histories. They are not on the public memorials. They are, in the most precise sense of the phrase, unrecognized. Not because their contributions were unworthy of recognition, but because the organizations that used those contributions were built on the principle that recognition and effectiveness were incompatible, and that the people who worked within them had agreed in advance to accept that bargain. Most of them kept their end of it. For most of them, no one kept the other end. Fact number 61. In the jungle highlands of occupied Burma, the OSS ran one of the most operationally successful and most poorly recognized intelligence and guerrilla operations of the entire Pacific War. OSS Detachment 101, established in 1942 with a founding strength of barely 22 Americans, built a force of over 10,000 indigenous fighters, primarily Kachin tribespeople, from the hill regions of northern Burma, who conducted intelligence collection, sabotage, and direct combat operations against Japanese forces across an immense and nearly roadless landscape. By the time the war ended, Detachment 101 had killed or disabled an estimated 10,000 Japanese soldiers, rescued over 200 downed Allied airmen, and provided the intelligence mapping of Japanese positions that made the Allied reconquest of northern Burma operationally feasible. The Kachin fighters who made this possible were not auxiliary forces in any marginal sense. They were the operation. They knew the terrain, the language, the paths, the seasonal patterns of the rivers, and the locations of every Japanese outpost in the region. They fought with a discipline and effectiveness that exceeded anything a newly arrived American officer could have achieved alone. When the war ended, the Americans went home. The Kachin fighters, who had served at the specific request of the United States government and at considerable personal and community risk, received no formal recognition from the United States, no pension, and no acknowledgement in any public account of the operation for decades. They had given everything. The record gave them nothing back. Fact number 62. At the peak of its operation in January 1945, Bletchley Park employed nearly 10,000 people. Of those 10,000, roughly 75% were women. They worked the machines, processed the intercepts, operated the Bombay decryption devices that ran continuously through the day and night, cross-checked the decoded traffic, and maintained the logistical and administrative systems that kept the most complex intelligence operation in the history of the war functioning without interruption. The names that history carried forward from Bletchley Park are almost entirely male. Alan Turing, Gordon Welchman, Bill Tutte, because those are the names attached to the intellectual breakthroughs that shaped the code-breaking effort. But intellectual breakthroughs without operational infrastructure produce nothing. The thousands of women who staffed Bletchley were not merely support personnel in the sense that word implies. They were the operational core of the enterprise, the people who turned mathematical insight into actionable intelligence, message by message, shift after shift, year after year, in conditions of absolute secrecy, under instructions never to speak to anyone about what they were doing. Many signed the Official Secrets Act and kept their silence for over 50 years. When the story of Bletchley Park was finally partially declassified in the 1970s, the initial accounts focused almost entirely on the male mathematicians. The women who had kept the operation running took considerably longer to enter the public record. Some never did. Some died still keeping the secret they had been asked to keep, carrying it all the way to the end. Fact number 63. There is a specific kind of intelligence work that almost never appears in any popular account of the war, and it is among the most consequential of all: the analysis of aerial photography. By the middle of the war, the Allies were conducting systematic photographic reconnaissance flights over occupied Europe and Asia, producing millions of photographs of enemy positions, infrastructure, supply lines, and fortifications. The photographs were interpreted by teams of specialists, many of them women, who could identify, from images taken at thousands of feet, the presence of a new gun emplacement, the recent activity of a railway marshalling yard, or the subtle shadow patterns that indicated the presence of underground storage. These analysts were never in the field. They sat in offices and applied skills that combined scientific training, pattern recognition, and an intimate familiarity with how specific types of military infrastructure appeared from the air. Their work shaped bombing targets, informed amphibious landing plans, and provided the physical context that made agent-reported intelligence coherent and usable. The woman most associated with this work, Constance Babington Smith, who identified V-1 flying bomb launch sites at Peenemünde from reconnaissance photographs in 1943, was eventually recognized. The hundreds of other photo interpreters who contributed to the same work day after day across every theater of the war did not make it into any history. They looked at millions of photographs so that others could make decisions. The decisions were remembered, the looking was not. Fact number 64. The physical reality of the parachute drop. The mechanism by which the vast majority of SOE and OSS agents entered occupied territory deserves more attention than it usually receives as an experience in itself. An agent parachuting into enemy territory at night jumped from a low-flying aircraft, usually at around 600 feet, in conditions designed to minimize the sound of the engines. They landed in fields, forests, hillsides, and occasionally in entirely wrong places, on the edge of a village, near a road, once memorably in a German military installation, rather than the intended reception field. They were alone or in a small group, carrying their equipment in a kit bag attached to their leg, responsible for burying their parachute within minutes of landing, making contact with a reception committee they knew only by pre-arranged signal, and beginning the transition from the person they actually were to the person their papers said they were, immediately, in the dark, in a country they may have visited only in peacetime or not at all. The first hours after a drop were among the most dangerous in any deployment. An agent who had landed off target or whose reception committee had been compromised was alone in occupied territory with no immediate means of contact and no safe house yet established. The operational reports that record these drops are terse and procedural. They do not convey what those first hours felt like, and the agents who could convey it, for the most part, never wrote about it. Fact number 65. The experience of agents who were captured, interrogated, survived, and returned after the war presents a particular problem for the history of recognition. An agent who died in captivity could eventually be awarded a posthumous decoration. The machinery of official acknowledgement, however slow, had a category for them. An agent who survived captivity existed in a more complicated space. They were alive. They had returned. The war was over. The official position, in most cases, was that the matter was closed. What they had endured, weeks or months of interrogation, solitary confinement, torture described in official records with administrative detachment as harsh treatment, was their own private history now. Some survived and rebuilt their lives with remarkable resilience. Some survived and could not function in ordinary life at all. Some spent years in a condition that today would be immediately recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but which, in the late 1940s and early 1950s had no name, no treatment protocol, and no institutional recognition from the governments that had sent these individuals into the circumstances that produced it. The welfare structure for returning agents was minimal to the point of near non-existence. A payment, a handshake, and a reminder of the Official Secrets Act. The idea that an organization had an ongoing obligation to the people it had deployed, that the contract extended beyond the end of active service, was not part of the institutional culture of any Allied intelligence organization in 1945. They had given everything. The door closed behind them, and that was that. Fact number 66. There was a network operating in occupied France that ran for nearly 3 years without any connection to either the SOE or the Free French. Organized and sustained entirely by a group of American women who happened to be living in Paris when the occupation began. They had remained after most Americans left, for various reasons. Some married to French citizens, some too elderly or unwell to travel, some simply unwilling to abandon lives they had built over years. And in the vacuum that followed, several of them began doing what the circumstances seemed to require. They hid Allied soldiers, passed money to families whose breadwinners had been arrested, and collected and forwarded information about German dispositions and activities to contacts who moved it toward the border. They operated through a social network built on trust, developed over years of expatriate life in Paris. Dinner party acquaintances, cafe regulars, domestic staff, neighbors, none of them had training. Several were arrested at various points. One died in a German prison. The rest survived and returned to the United States after liberation. None received any formal recognition from the United States government, whose citizens they were and in whose interest they had, entirely voluntarily and without compensation, assumed risks that qualified agents were trained and paid to bear. Their story, reconstructed by researchers decades later from letters and diaries, is a precise illustration of the gap between what wartime intelligence actually required and what any official history of it has ever been willing to acknowledge. Fact number 67. There is a name in the archive of unrecognized wartime intelligence work that deserves to be said clearly: Lillian Rolfe. She was a British woman born in Paris in 1914, recruited by the SOE after working as a wireless operator for the RAF. She was parachuted into occupied France in April 1944, operated under the codename Nadine, and worked as a wireless operator in the Loire Valley. She knew the statistics. The average life expectancy for an SOE wireless operator in occupied France in 1944 was 6 weeks. She operated for several months, continuing to transmit after falling seriously ill with a pulmonary condition that made the physical demands of the work, moving transmitters, cycling between locations, crouching in attics, genuinely agonizing. She was arrested in August 1944, just weeks before the Allied liberation of the region where she had been working. She was taken to Ravensbrück concentration camp in January 1945. Too ill to walk, she was carried to the place of execution on a stretcher and shot. She had refused, throughout her imprisonment, to reveal anything about her network. She was awarded the Croix de Guerre and the MBE posthumously, but for decades remained almost entirely absent from any widely read account of the war. Her specific courage, choosing to continue working past the point where her body could support the effort, refusing to speak under conditions that would have broken most people, deserves to be remembered in its full particularity, not absorbed into the general category of SOE heroism, remembered as hers. Fact number 68. The question of what the Allied intelligence services knew, and when they knew it, about the fate of agents who had been captured is one of the most uncomfortable in the entire history of wartime espionage. The evidence suggests that in several cases, intelligence officers in London were aware, or had strong reason to suspect, that specific agents had been captured, and that further communications using their call signs were being generated under German control. In the Dutch England spiel, the missing security checks were a clear signal. In France, there were occasions when the behavior of certain networks, the unusual promptness of responses, the absence of small operational delays that normally characterized field operations, The failure to request resupply at expected intervals suggested something was wrong. The institutional response to these signals was, in almost every case, to continue operating. The reasons were genuine and complex. Ending contact would alert the Germans that their deception had been detected. Maintaining it allowed London to control what information was passed back, but the consequence was that agents operating under German control continued to appear in official records as active operatives, and in some cases had additional agents sent to join their already compromised networks. The people who made those decisions were not callous individuals. They were doing what the logic of their situation required. But the people who paid the consequences were the agents in the field, and the history of those decisions has taken decades to reach any kind of honest public accounting. Fact number 69. Consider the position of an agent who has successfully completed their mission and been safely exfiltrated, who has returned to Britain, been debriefed, signed the necessary documents, and been quietly thanked for their service. They are sitting perhaps in a flat in London, or on a train heading home to a provincial town where their family lives. And they are carrying inside them a complete world that nobody around them knows exists. Not the general fact of it, not simply that they had been a spy, the specific weight of it, the specific names of people they had known and lost, the specific locations of safe houses they had slept in and would never see again, the specific faces of people who had helped them and who may or may not have survived, the specific memory of the moment they had nearly been caught, the sound of footsteps on a particular staircase, the cold of a particular field, the 17 minutes a pickup was late while they stood in the dark not knowing if it was coming at all. All of this specific, irreducible, untransferable weight had to be carried from that moment forward inside an ordinary life, in conditions of enforced silence, without any of the rituals that societies usually offer to acknowledge what a person has endured. Most of them managed it. All of them carried it. None of them should have had to carry it entirely alone, and most of them did, for the rest of their lives, in the quietest possible way. Fact number 70. The African American contribution to wartime intelligence has received some scholarly attention in recent years, but remains largely outside the mainstream account of Allied espionage during the Second World War. Several African American men and women served in the OSS in capacities ranging from research analysis to field operations, in a period when the United States military was still formally segregated and when the institutional culture of the intelligence services reflected the broader racial hierarchies of American society. Their service was complicated by the fact that they were expected to demonstrate patriotism to a country that denied them full citizenship, and that the racial dynamics of occupied Europe created specific operational possibilities and specific vulnerabilities that white officers could not fully understand or manage. In North Africa and in parts of Europe, where African American presence was unusual and therefore noticeable, some operatives found their very visibility became a liability. In other contexts, particularly in French colonial territories, their presence attracted less suspicious scrutiny than a white American would. The specific contributions of individual African American OSS personnel were often recorded without racial identification in official files, making subsequent research difficult. The institutional history of the OSS, as it was written by the organization's predominantly white leadership, did not make the inclusion of these contributions a priority. The correction of that omission has been the work of individual researchers and archivists. It is still incomplete. The names are still being recovered, one careful search at a time. Fact number 71. There is a particular category of wartime agent whose contribution to Allied intelligence was both enormous and entirely overlooked for a reason that, on reflection, tells you almost everything about how the history was written. They were old. The assumption that intelligence work required youth, physical speed, quick reflexes, the ability to pass as a student or a young professional, was so deeply embedded in the culture of the Allied intelligence services that older agents who operated effectively were treated as exceptions rather than as evidence that the assumption was wrong. And yet some of the most effective resistance intelligence operatives in occupied Europe were people in their 50s and 60s. Men who had fought in the First World War and retained habits of operational caution that younger agents lacked. Women whose age rendered them effectively invisible to German security services focused on younger suspects. Professionals whose established community positions gave them access to information and social trust that no parachuted newcomer could replicate. An elderly doctor who had practiced in a French town for 30 years could learn more about German garrison health, morale, and operational capability than any outside agent sent to study the same question. An older woman who ran a local food distribution network had contacts, access, and cover that no training course could manufacture. These people do not appear in the history of Allied intelligence as agents. They appear, if at all, as sources, a characterization that accurately describes their function but entirely obscures the courage and commitment their participation required. They were not sources, they were people who chose at considerable personal risk to act. Fact number 72. The question of motivation is one that intelligence historians rarely pursue with adequate seriousness for agents below the level of major operations. Why did a French schoolteacher in Lyon agree to pass messages for a network she did not fully understand? Why did a Dutch printer continue forging identity documents after 2 of his colleagues had been arrested? Why did a Belgian shopkeeper hide a stranger's radio equipment under the floorboards of his shop for 3 months? The simplest answer, patriotism, is true as far as it goes but does not go very far. The more honest answer is that motivation, like courage, is rarely a single consistent thing. It is a daily renegotiation with fear, circumstance, and conscience. Some people acted from fury at what they had seen done to their neighbors. Some acted from loyalty to a specific person who had asked for help. Some acted from ideology, some from religion, some from the simple stubborn conviction that cooperation with an occupier was a form of self-betrayal they were not willing to accept. Some began with one motivation and continued with another, fear gradually overtaken by habit, or habit periodically renewed by some fresh outrage that restored the original clarity. What almost none of them could have explained is what kept them going through the middle stretch, the long grey months when nothing dramatic happened, when the occupation seemed permanent, when the risk was constant and the outcome invisible. That is where the truest courage lived, and it is where the history is, necessarily, most silent. Fact number 73. There is a phrase in the memoirs of several former SOE officers that appears often enough to be almost a formula. They did their duty and asked for nothing in return. It is meant as praise, and it is praise. But if you read it carefully, it also describes a bargain that was entirely one-sided. Duty is a word that describes obligation, and obligation runs in 2 directions. When a person accepts an obligation to serve, the organization that has received that service incurs a corresponding obligation to acknowledge it. The phrase "they did their duty and asked for nothing in return" contains, embedded in its apparent admiration, a quiet relief that the debt was never called in. The agents who worked in occupied Europe did their duty. They asked for very little in return. Recognition, in most cases, was not something they expected or demanded. But the absence of that recognition is not a neutral fact. It is a choice made by the institutions that used their courage, the choice to maintain secrecy longer than secrecy required, the choice to declassify selectively rather than comprehensively, the choice to write histories that focused on organizational achievement rather than individual contribution. These were not inevitable consequences of the nature of intelligence work. They were decisions, made by people with institutional authority, that determined whose courage would be remembered and whose would not. The agents who were not remembered did not make that choice. It was made for them. And it was made quietly enough that most people never noticed it had been made at all. Fact number 74. There was a woman in Switzerland during the war whose job title officially was that of a secretary at the American consulate in Bern. Her actual function was considerably more important. She served as a communications conduit for one of the most productive Allied intelligence networks in occupied Europe, managing the flow of information between Alan Dulles, the OSS station chief in Bern, and the network of sources he had developed inside Germany itself, including agents within the German Foreign Ministry and the Wehrmacht. The intelligence product of this network shaped Allied understanding of German intentions at the highest level. The secretary who moved that product through the communication chain, who encoded and decoded messages, managed the physical security of the most sensitive files in the consulate, and kept the administrative machinery of the station functioning across years of wartime pressure, received no public credit for this work during her lifetime, and no place in any history of the burned station written in the decades after the war. Dulles himself was celebrated as the mastermind of American wartime intelligence in Europe, as the future director of the CIA, as one of the founding figures of the American intelligence community. The people around him who made his operation run did not share in that celebration. They are the invisible infrastructure behind a visible figure, which is the pattern repeated endlessly across the history of wartime espionage. The name at the top was remembered. The hands that held everything together were not. Fact number 75. The story of wartime intelligence in occupied Poland does not end with the Enigma contribution or the V-weapon reporting, important as both were. It extends through the entire occupation, across one of the most brutally governed territories in the war, and it includes dimensions of intelligence work that no other occupied country was required to undertake. Polish underground intelligence officers collected and transmitted to London detailed evidence of the systematic mass murder being carried out at Auschwitz, evidence that reached Allied governments years before the end of the war, and was, for reasons that remain among the most painful questions in the history of Allied decision-making, not acted upon with the urgency the reports demanded. The Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, was at its peak the largest single underground resistance organization in the world, numbering close to 400,000 members, running intelligence networks that covered every region of occupied Poland, and maintaining a shadow government, shadow courts, and shadow schools operating beneath the surface of German occupation. When the war ended and Poland was delivered into the Soviet sphere of influence, the men and women who had served the Armia Krajowa found themselves classified as enemies of the new state. Many were arrested, some were executed. The intelligence they had provided to the Western Allies, intelligence that had directly served Allied military operations, counted for nothing in the political settlement of 1945. They had served causes that the post-war world arranged to forget, and the post-war world was, in this respect, remarkably thorough. Fact number 76. Witold Pilecki did something that no intelligence service in the world would have sanctioned if asked to approve it in advance. In September 1940 he walked voluntarily into a German street roundup in Warsaw, allowed himself to be taken, and was transported to Auschwitz concentration camp, specifically so that he could organize a resistance network inside the camp and report what he found there to the outside world. He spent 2 years and 7 months inside Auschwitz. During that time he organized a resistance cell that eventually numbered several hundred inmates and sent at least 10 intelligence reports out of the camp through a network of smuggled messages, documenting the gas chambers, the scale of killing, the organization of the murder program, and the identities of responsible German officers. He escaped in April 1943, crossed occupied Poland with German forces hunting him, and delivered his reports in person to the Polish Home Army leadership. The reports reached London. Allied governments had, through Pilecki's intelligence, detailed and credible documentation of what was happening at Auschwitz years before the camp was liberated. Pilecki then fought in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944 and survived. After the war, in a communist Poland that regarded his entire service as treasonous, he was arrested, tortured, tried on fabricated charges, and executed in May 1948. He was 57 years old. He was not formally rehabilitated by Poland until 1990. He received no recognition from any Western Allied government during his lifetime. He had walked into the darkest place on earth to tell the world what was happening there. The world noted it and moved on. Fact number 77. The intelligence networks operating in North Africa during the Desert Campaign of 1940 to 1943 have received considerably less attention than those in occupied Europe, partly because the strategic geography of the campaign was different, and partly because the intelligence dimension of the North African War has been overshadowed by the Enigma decryption story. But human intelligence was critical in North Africa in ways that signals intelligence alone could not replace. Local agents, Libyan, Egyptian, Tunisian, and Algerian men and women who understood the terrain, the tribal structures, the water sources, the routes and the loyalties of the populations through which both armies moved, provided Allied intelligence with information that shaped operational planning at every level. The OSS established its first significant Mediterranean operation in North Africa in 1942, running networks of local informants alongside the formal military intelligence structure. The specific identities and contributions of the indigenous informants who fed this network are almost entirely absent from any official history of the campaign. They were, by institutional habit and by the cultural assumptions of the period, classified as sources rather than agents, a distinction that determined how they were described, how they were compensated, and whether their contributions were ever acknowledged in any form that made it into the public record. The desert campaigns were fought across their land, using their knowledge along routes they identified. The histories of those campaigns were written by people who did not think to ask their names. Fact number 78. The children who carried messages during the Second World War are a subject that history has approached only tentatively, because it sits at the junction of admiration and discomfort. In occupied Poland, France, the Netherlands, and across most of Europe, children as young as 10 or 11 were used as couriers by resistance networks, carrying documents, messages, and small packages through checkpoints where German soldiers were less likely to search them thoroughly, delivering information to contacts in ways that attracted less suspicion than any adult movement could achieve. The adults who used them knew exactly what they were doing. The children knew, in most cases, something of what they were carrying, enough to understand the danger, not quite enough to compromise the network if they were caught. Some were caught, some were interrogated, some were deported. They carried the weight of things they barely understood through streets that had been their ordinary childhood streets just a few years before, doing a job that no child should have been asked to do and that many of them did with a steadiness that was quietly extraordinary. The children who carried resistance messages and survived grew up into adults who were, in most cases, never formally acknowledged for what they had done. Acknowledging them required acknowledging that the resistance had placed children in danger, which complicated the moral clarity that post-war commemorations preferred to maintain. Their contribution was real. Their invisibility in the record is a form of protection extended too late by the same world that had needed them to be brave. Fact number 79. The role of neutral countries in the intelligence war of the Second World War was indispensable, deeply complex, and almost entirely unacknowledged in the standard histories of Allied espionage. Switzerland, Sweden, Portugal, Spain, and Turkey were the operational platforms from which Allied intelligence services ran networks into occupied Europe and Axis territory, maintained communication with agents, recruited new sources, and exchanged intelligence through channels that formal diplomatic structures could not accommodate. The citizens of these neutral countries who assisted Allied intelligence did so in conditions of considerable personal risk. Their governments were under sustained German pressure. German intelligence services operated openly within their borders. The consequences of exposure could include diplomatic incidents, imprisonment, or worse. Swiss citizens who passed information about German military movements to Allied contacts in Bern, Swedish diplomats who acted as informal channels for intelligence products that could not move through official channels, Portuguese businessmen who reported on German shipping activity to contacts in Lisbon. These people had no formal status as Allied agents, no cover from any government, and no claim on any post-war recognition process. They operated in the specific grey zone that neutral geography created, and their contributions to the Allied intelligence effort were absorbed into the output of formal networks without attribution or acknowledgement. They had helped from the outside where no one was keeping track, and the record treated them accordingly, as if they had never been there at all. Fact number 80. There is a quality of attention that skilled intelligence work requires which has no name in any language that adequately captures what it is. It is not simply concentration, it is not simply observation. It is the ability to look at the ordinary surface of a scene, a railway station, a cafe, a street corner, a government office, and perceive within it the specific details that indicate something other than what the surface presents. The German officer who always takes the same table suggests a man whose security consciousness is low, and low security consciousness suggests things about the culture of his unit. The shipment of medical supplies moving through a particular junction at 3 in the morning suggests a planned military operation within the next 72 hours. The sudden absence of a face that is usually present on a particular street corner suggests that the person has been arrested, which suggests that the network they were part of may be under pressure. This quality of attention, trained, disciplined, systematic, and entirely invisible in its exercise, was the fundamental professional skill of the field intelligence operative, more important than physical courage, more fundamental than any technical knowledge of codes or equipment. The agents who possessed it in the highest degree were almost invariably the ones who survived longest and produced the most valuable intelligence. Their names are almost invariably the ones that appear least frequently in any public history of the organizations they served. The best ones left almost no trace. That was the point, and that is the problem. Fact number 81. The Indian subcontinent produced intelligence operatives during the Second World War whose contributions have been almost entirely excluded from the English-language histories of Allied espionage. The SOE's operations in India and Southeast Asia included the recruitment of Indian agents who moved through Japanese-occupied Burma, Thailand, and Malaya, territories that European agents could not penetrate without immediately attracting fatal attention. These Indian operatives spoke the languages of the region, understood its social and cultural structures, could move through markets and villages and official buildings without the specific visibility that any European presence would have generated, and provided Allied intelligence with information about Japanese positions, supply lines, and local political conditions that shaped the Burma campaign at every level. After the war, Indian independence and the dissolution of the British imperial intelligence structure created an institutional gap through which their records largely fell. The files that documented their service were distributed across organizations, the SOE, the Indian Political Intelligence Service, the newly independent Indian government, none of which had a strong institutional interest in maintaining the comprehensive record that recognition would have required. Individual Indian agents who had served in Burma and Malaya found themselves, after independence, in a country whose intelligence history was being written from scratch, in which their British-directed wartime service occupied an ambiguous position that made formal acknowledgement politically complicated on both sides of the former colonial relationship. They had served at the sharpest edge of the war in Asia. The history of that war was written without them. Fact number 82. The relationship between the Allied intelligence services and the press during the Second World War was one of the most carefully managed information control operations in history, and understanding it helps explain why the public account of wartime espionage remains so incomplete. War correspondents were accredited, censored, and in many cases informally managed by the same intelligence services whose operations they might otherwise have reported on. Journalists who became aware of significant intelligence operations, the existence of the SOE, the scale of the double agent program, the success of Enigma decryption, were persuaded, pressured, or legally required to say nothing. Some were themselves recruited as intelligence assets, using their legitimate press credentials as cover for intelligence gathering. The result was that public understanding of the war, formed in real time through the press, was shaped by an information environment that was itself a product of intelligence management. The agents, the networks, the operations, the failures, and the human costs of wartime espionage were invisible not only because they were secret, but because the systems designed to keep them secret extended all the way into the media that might have reported on them. When the story eventually began to emerge, through declassification, through memoirs, through the patient work of historians, it emerged into a public that had been successfully conditioned for 30 years to expect that the intelligence dimension of the war was basically summarized by what they already knew. It was not. It had never been. The full picture was considerably larger, considerably darker, and considerably more human than anything the managed version had allowed. Fact number 83. The specific experience of agents who were sent back into the field after a previous deployment, knowing everything a first deployment had taught them about what capture actually meant, is a category of courage that defies easy description. A first-time agent parachuting into occupied France had a theoretical understanding of the risks and a trained but untested set of responses to danger. An agent returning for a second deployment had something different, a specific, grounded, experiential knowledge of what the work actually felt like, of how quickly a network could unravel, of exactly what happened to the people who were caught. Several SOE agents made multiple deployments. Some went back because they were asked and could not think of a good reason to refuse. Some went back because the work had become in some way they found difficult to explain, more natural to them than the ordinary life they returned to between deployments. Some went back because the people they had worked with previously were still in the field, and abandoning them felt worse than the danger of returning. None of these motivations appear in any official record. What the official record shows is a name, a date, and a code name. The specific human reasoning that put a person on an aircraft over France for the second or third time in a war that had already shown them everything it was capable of is invisible, because the person who could have explained it was usually too busy staying alive to write it down. Fact number 84. By the end of the war, the Allied intelligence services had established over 250 separate networks across occupied France and Belgium alone, comprising more than 6,400 Belgian and French citizens who functioned in various capacities as intelligence sources, couriers, safe housekeepers, document forgers, wireless operators, and resistance organizers. That figure, 6,400, represents only the people enrolled in networks connected to formal Allied intelligence structures. The actual number of people who contributed in some way to Allied intelligence collection in France and Belgium alone was several times larger. The people who carried messages without being formally enrolled, who provided shelter for a single night, who reported on a single observation without being part of any network, these individuals are entirely outside the count of 6,400 and entirely outside any official recognition process that used network membership as its qualifying criterion. A person who risked their life for a single act, carrying a document through a checkpoint, hiding a stranger for one night, was making proportionally the same commitment as someone who joined a formal network and served for years. The official record did not treat them equivalently. The official record required paperwork, membership, and a chain of accountability that the most peripheral and, in some ways, the most courageous contributors simply did not possess. They had done the thing and left no document behind, and a record that required a document found nothing where they had been. Fact number 85. There is a specific group of women in the history of Allied wartime intelligence who have been called, in the few accounts that mention them, the cutouts, the people whose function was to sever the operational connection between two parts of a network so that if either part was compromised, the other could not be traced. A cutout received information from one source and passed it to another without those sources ever knowing each other's identities. A cutout was by design entirely expendable in the structural sense. Their arrest would not compromise either of the parties they connected. But expendable in that structural sense does not mean expendable in any human sense. A cutout who was arrested still faced interrogation, deportation, or execution. A cutout who survived still carried the full weight of what they had done and seen. The women who served as cutouts in French, Belgian, and Dutch resistance networks, chosen for this role precisely because German security services were less focused on middle-aged women than on men of military age, represent perhaps the most anonymous category of all the anonymous contributors to Allied intelligence. They exist in the record, where they exist at all, as the gaps between more visible figures, the absences that, if you look carefully enough at the structure of any documented network, tell you that someone was there whose name was never written down. They connected things. They kept things from unraveling. They were the joints in the structure, and like most joints in most structures, nobody noticed them until they were gone. Fact number 86. The post-war fate of the intelligence networks themselves is a story that has never been adequately told. When the war ended, the SOE was dissolved in 1946. The OSS was dissolved even faster. President Truman signed the order disbanding it on the 20th of September 1945, barely 6 weeks after the Japanese surrender. The networks those organizations had built across occupied Europe were simply switched off. Local agents who had been operating in the field found that their contact in London or Washington was no longer there. that the communication channels through which they had reported had been closed, and that the organization that had recruited them, trained them, paid them, and asked them to risk their lives no longer existed in any form that could answer a letter or process a pension claim. Some agents were formally stood down with letters of thanks, many were not. The files that documented their service were scattered across successor organizations. MI6 absorbed some SOE functions. The CIA was established in 1947 to take over some OSS functions, but the specific records of individual agents, particularly local sources and resistance members who had never been formally enrolled, often did not travel with any institutional continuity to any successor body. They were, in the most literal administrative sense, abandoned at the end of the war by the institutions that had used them, not through malice, but through the specific institutional indifference that follows when an organization ceases to exist, and its responsibilities become nobody's in particular. The networks dissolved. The people who had been inside them were left to find their own way home. Fact number 87. There is something worth understanding about how betrayal functioned inside wartime resistance networks, because history tends to treat it as exceptional when in fact it was endemic. Every network that operated for more than a few months in occupied territory did so in an environment in which German intelligence services were actively and resourcefully trying to penetrate it. They used informers, paid informers, coerced informers, ideological sympathizers, and people who had been frightened or tortured into cooperation. They used honey trap operations, fake resistance contacts, and the systematic exploitation of the cell structure to work inward from the periphery. Many networks were eventually penetrated not by dramatic double-agent operations, but by the patient, methodical process of following a single thread, a face seen twice near a safe house, a name mentioned in a document found during an unrelated arrest, a wireless signal triangulated to within a city block. The people who resisted this pressure, who refused to give names under interrogation, who maintained their cover story through weeks of questioning, who died without betraying a single contact, performed acts of moral courage whose consequences were specific and measurable. Each name not given was a person who remained free, a network section that continued operating, a line of intelligence that kept flowing to London. That specific moral courage, the refusal to trade another person's life for relief from one's own suffering, is the most consistently unacknowledged contribution in the entire history of the war. It happened in darkness, in pain, without witnesses, and it saved lives that never knew they had been saved. Fact number 88. The physical objects of wartime espionage, the tools and devices and everyday objects that concealed extraordinary purposes, have received a great deal of popular attention, largely because they are concrete and interesting. The pipe that concealed a gun, the playing cards with maps printed inside their layers, the shoelace that concealed a one-time encryption pad, the hollow coin that concealed a microfilm. These objects are exhibited in museums, described in popular histories, and celebrated as evidence of Allied ingenuity. What they do not convey, displayed behind museum glass, is the human context in which they functioned. The pipe was carried by a person who smoked it in cafes while watching a door. The playing cards were memorized by a person who knew they could not be found with them if arrested. The shoelace was wound into the hair of a 23-year-old cycling through checkpoints in Normandy. The hollow coin was carried by a person whose entire life depended on no one finding it. The objects are interesting. The people who carried them are irreplaceable, and the asymmetry between the attention given to the objects and the attention given to the people who used them is, in miniature, the essential problem with how the history of wartime intelligence has generally been written. The concrete and displayable has persistently crowded out the human and invisible. The things survived in cases, the people survived in silence, and silence, unlike glass, is not something you can see through. Fact number 89. The Greek Resistance Intelligence Network, at its most operational in 1943 and 1944, produced intelligence that shaped Allied strategy in the Eastern Mediterranean in ways that have been consistently under-acknowledged. The SOE mission in Greece, operating alongside a resistance movement that by 1944 included well over 100,000 armed members and a far larger civilian support structure, gathered intelligence on German garrison strengths, Axis shipping in the Aegean, and the position and condition of German forces across the Greek mainland. This intelligence fed into Allied planning for the Italian campaign and for the broader strategic question of where to apply pressure in southeastern Europe. The Greek partisans who provided the human intelligence base for this work operated in conditions of extreme danger. German reprisals against partisan activity in Greece were among the most severe in any occupied country, involving the destruction of entire villages and the mass execution of civilian populations in response to resistance operations. The individuals who sustained intelligence collection under these conditions received, in the main, recognition only from their own government and their own communities after the war. The British and American governments that used the intelligence they produced maintained no systematic record of individual Greek contributors. The post-war political situation in Greece, which moved directly from liberation into civil war, prevented any comprehensive national accounting of who had contributed what. The intelligence was used. The people who gathered it were left to find their own recognition in a country that was already tearing itself apart before the last German soldier had left. Fact number 90. The work of translation is so deeply embedded in the operational structure of wartime intelligence that it is almost invisible as a category of contribution in itself. Every intercepted German communication that reached an Allied analyst had been translated. Every agent report written in French, Polish, Norwegian, Italian, or Dutch had been translated before it entered the Allied intelligence system in a form that English-reading officers could use. Every interrogation of a captured German officer required a translator present. The translation work of the Second World War was performed by thousands of individuals, refugees, academics, teachers, and language students recruited into military and civilian intelligence services for this specific purpose. Many of them were Jewish European émigrés who had left Germany, Austria, or Eastern Europe in the 1930s, and whose native fluency in German made them uniquely valuable for translation and for the interpretation of cultural and political context that bare linguistic translation could not provide. They worked at every level of the intelligence hierarchy, from frontline interrogation units in North Africa and Italy to the analysis rooms of MI6 and the OSS. Their contribution was both fundamental and invisible, because the product that emerged from their work bore no trace of the translation process. It looked, in the finished intelligence report, as if it had always been in English, which is precisely what effective translation achieves, and precisely why the people who produced it left almost no mark on the record. The better they did their job, the less visible their job became. That invisibility was the measure of their skill. It was also the reason nobody remembered them. Fact number 91. There is a moment described in several post-war memoirs by former resistance members that occurs in the hours immediately after liberation, when the German soldiers have left and the Allied forces have not yet fully arrived, and the city or town or village is, for the first time in years, genuinely free. The feeling described is almost never simple joy. It is complicated, disorienting, and in many cases contaminated by grief for the people who had not survived to see it. The resistance members who had been living double lives, the schoolteacher who had also been a courier, the baker who had also been hiding weapons, the pharmacist who had also been forging documents, found themselves in the extraordinary position of no longer needing to be two people simultaneously, and discovered that the simpler version of themselves they were returning to felt strangely thin. The work had defined them in ways that peacetime could not continue. The danger had given the days a clarity that safety could not replicate. Some of them found the transition to ordinary life almost impossible, not because they had been damaged by the war, though many had, but because the most meaningful thing they had ever done was a thing they could not speak about, and the identity that had carried them through it was no longer available to them. They had been invisible by necessity. They remained invisible by habit, and the history of the war was written by people who had not noticed, from the outside, that they were there. Fact number 92. The final months of the war created a specific intelligence problem that has received almost no historical attention. What to do with the networks that had been built at enormous cost once the military need for them had passed? In France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway, liberation did not immediately terminate the intelligence operations that had been running. German forces were still present in parts of these countries. German intelligence agents were still operating. The networks that had been gathering intelligence about German positions continued, for weeks or months after local liberation, to provide information that shaped the continuing Allied advance eastward. The agents who staffed these networks were, in this final period, in a distinctly strange position. The occupation that had defined their operational environment had ended. The institutional structures that had run them were beginning to dissolve. The specific danger of the previous years had receded but had not entirely gone, and they were being asked to continue functioning in professional conditions that were dissolving around them, for an Allied military structure whose attention had already moved east towards Germany itself. Several agents who were killed or captured in this final period have received even less recognition than agents who died during the peak occupation years, because the circumstances of their deaths did not fit neatly into the commemorative narrative that liberation had established. They died after the liberation of their country, for the continuation of a war that the victory celebrations had prematurely declared over. The flags were already out. Nobody was watching the edges anymore. Fact number 93. The women of Bletchley Park who worked the Bombay machines deserve a specific fact of their own, separate from the broader acknowledgement of Bletchley's workforce, because their contribution was both physically demanding and intellectually precise, in ways that the popular image of wartime code-breaking rarely conveys. The Bombay machines, electromechanical devices built to test possible Enigma settings and identify the daily cipher keys, ran continuously through every shift, in huts that were cold in winter and unbearably hot in summer, generating a noise that made sustained conversation impossible, and a level of mechanical vibration that caused real physical fatigue after hours of operation. The women who operated them worked around the clock on rotating shifts, monitoring the machines for the telltale stop that indicated a possible solution, running diagnostic checks, clearing mechanical faults, and maintaining the specific procedural discipline that the accuracy of the process required. A single procedural error, a setting applied incorrectly, a fault missed, a result recorded inaccurately, could mean that a valid solution was discarded, which could mean that an intercept that should have been decoded was not, which could mean that an intelligence product that should have shaped an operational decision did not reach the people who needed it. The women who operated the Bombays understood this chain of consequence. They worked with the concentration it demanded, on rotating shifts for years, in conditions that were never comfortable, for an organization that did not publicly acknowledge their existence until 3 decades after the war had ended. Fact number 94. The question of how many people total participated in Allied intelligence collection during the Second World War, across all networks, all countries, all levels of formal and informal involvement, is one that no historian has ever been able to answer with confidence, because the nature of the activity made comprehensive recording impossible. The formal personnel of the SOE numbered approximately 13,000. The OSS at its peak numbered around 13,000 as well. The formal resistance membership in France alone has been estimated at between 200,000 and 400,000 at the time of liberation, though these numbers include fighters, political organizers, and logistical supporters alongside intelligence contributors. Across all the occupied countries of Europe, the conservative estimate of people who participated in some form of resistance intelligence activity, from formal network membership to a single act of information passing, runs into the millions. The precise number is unknowable. What is knowable is that the history of wartime intelligence as it has been written accounts for a tiny fraction of those millions. The official histories name dozens. The academic histories name hundreds. The most comprehensive biographical databases name a few thousand. The rest, the enormous majority of the people who collected, moved, processed, or sheltered the intelligence that shaped the Allied war effort, are absent from every record, remembered only, if at all, by the diminishing circle of people who knew them personally and who are themselves now almost entirely gone. Fact number 95. The deception operation that preceded the D-Day landings, known comprehensively as Operation Bodyguard, was the largest and most sophisticated strategic deception in the history of warfare. and its success depended on a supporting cast of anonymous contributors whose names are almost never mentioned in accounts of the operation. The headline achievement of Bodyguard was the creation and maintenance of a fictional army group, the First United States Army Group, or FUSAG, projected to the German High Command as the main invasion force preparing to land at Pas de Calais. This projection was supported by false signals traffic, fake military encampments, dummy equipment visible to German reconnaissance aircraft, and above all by the double agent network feeding the Germans a consistent stream of intelligence confirming the deception. The people who created the false signals traffic, the wireless operators who transmitted messages for units that did not exist, maintaining the operational patterns that would make the traffic seem real, were performing an intelligence function as important as any field deployment, in conditions of absolute secrecy. When D-Day succeeded, the credit went to the planners, the commanders, and the celebrated double agents whose names have now entered popular history. The wireless operators who transmitted for phantom armies, the analysts who maintained the consistency of the false order of battle, the staff officers who coordinated the hundreds of small deceptions that together composed the larger one. These people are, with very few exceptions, unnamed in any public account of the operation. The Phantom Army was convincing because real people made it so. Those people remained phantoms themselves. Fact number 96. The experience of liberation for many resistance intelligence agents contained a specific surprise that the commemorative histories have never adequately described. The discovery that their contribution was not what the liberating forces most wanted to celebrate, the narrative that Allied military authorities preferred, and that the post-war political establishments of occupied countries largely adopted, was a narrative of armed resistance, of fighters who had faced the enemy directly, of battles in the mountains and sabotage operations against infrastructure, of a people who had refused subjugation. This narrative was not false. It was incomplete. The intelligence dimension of resistance, the patient, invisible, daily collection and transmission of information that shaped Allied operations at the strategic level, was harder to dramatize, less visible as an act of defiance, and more easily passed over in the public story of what the resistance had achieved. Agents who had spent years transmitting troop movements, forging documents, and managing safe-house networks found that the stories being told about the occupation were not stories about people like them. Their contribution was absorbed into the general acknowledgement of resistance heroism without specific recognition, which is a form of acknowledgement that manages, simultaneously, to include everyone and to remember no one in particular. They had done the invisible work, and when the celebrations came, the invisible work remained exactly that, invisible, unnarrated, and quietly left out of every speech that was given in every square in every newly liberated town. Fact number 97. There is a specific injustice at the heart of how many SOE agents were treated in the immediate aftermath of the war that deserves to be named directly. Agents who had served undercover identities, operating for years as French, Belgian, or Dutch citizens rather than as British military personnel, were classified, for the purposes of post-war recognition, as civilians rather than military personnel. This classification had significant consequences. Civilian service did not qualify for the same range of military decorations. Civilian service in a foreign country was administratively difficult to process through British recognition procedures, and civilian service conducted under a false identity created specific bureaucratic problems that no peacetime administrative system was designed to handle. Some agents received military decorations through special processes that bypassed normal administrative constraints. Many did not. The women who had served as field agents were particularly affected, because the military structures of the period were not designed to accommodate the formal recognition of women in operational combat roles, which is in every functional sense what SOE field deployment was. The categories that existed were wrong for what had actually been done, and when categories are wrong, the people who do not fit them fall through, not through oversight or malice, but through the specific cruelty of systems designed for a world they were being asked to accommodate without modification. The system was not changed to fit the people. The people were measured against the system and found to be the wrong shape. And the gap between what they had done and what the paperwork could acknowledge was where recognition went to quietly disappear. Fact number 98. The last known surviving female SOE agent, Phyllis Latour Doyle, the woman who hid her encryption codes in a knitting needle wound into her hair while cycling through German checkpoints in Normandy in 1944, was still alive in the early 2020s, in her late 90s, living in New Zealand. She had been there, in one form or another, since long after the war, living a life that bore almost no visible connection to the one she had led in occupied France at 23. She had said, in the interviews she eventually gave, that she had not told her children what she had done during the war. Not because she was ashamed of it, not because she had forgotten it, but because she had signed a document saying she would not speak about it, and she had taken that seriously for 50 years. And by the time it might have been permissible to speak, the habit of silence had become the shape of her life. There is something in that, the habit of silence becoming the shape of a life, that describes the experience of an entire generation of intelligence operatives more precisely than any more elaborate formulation could. They were asked to be invisible. They learned to be invisible so thoroughly that the invisibility outlasted its necessity and continued into old age and in many cases into death. The specific texture of what they had carried, alone for all that time, went with them, unrecorded, unwitnessed, into the same silence they had inhabited since 1945. Fact number 99. The intelligence contribution of the resistance networks to the success of the D-Day landings on the 6th of June 1944 was direct, measurable, and almost entirely unacknowledged in the public celebration of the operation. In the weeks before the landings, French resistance intelligence networks provided Allied planners with detailed reporting on the positions and strength of German coastal defenses in Normandy, the locations of specific gun emplacements, the disposition of German units inland, the condition of roads and bridges, the locations of German headquarters, and the routine patrol patterns of German security forces along the coast. This intelligence allowed Allied planners to identify specific weaknesses in the German defensive line, to target preliminary bombing runs with accuracy that aerial reconnaissance alone could not have achieved, and to plan the timing and sequencing of the landings with a level of tactical detail that required human observation at ground level. The individuals who collected and transmitted this intelligence were working under the full weight of German counterintelligence pressure in the weeks immediately before the landings, a period when German security services were at their most alert and the consequences of discovery were most severe. On the morning of the 6th of June, when the first Allied troops came ashore on the beaches of Normandy and the operation that changed the course of the war began, the resistance intelligence workers, whose reporting had shaped the plan, were invisible in the celebration of it. They had given what was needed. The people who received it did not stop to say their names. The beaches were named, the generals were named, the names of the people who had watched and reported and transmitted from the occupied fields above those beaches were not. Fact number 100. The archives are still opening. As recently as 2019, the CIA declassified files relating to wartime intelligence operations that contained the names of agents and sources who had never previously appeared in any public record. British intelligence files concerning SOE operations are still subject to partial restriction, with some personnel records not due for full release for decades yet. Polish archives opened after 1990 have revealed dimensions of Armia Krajowa intelligence work that were unknown in the West for 50 years. Greek, Italian, and Yugoslav archives are still in the process of being systematically catalogued and made accessible to researchers. The story of who served, what they did, and what happened to them is not finished. It is still being recovered, piece by piece, from files that were never meant to be seen, by researchers whose work will produce names and stories and specific acts of courage that no one living today knows about yet. Some of those names belong to people whose families have been trying for decades to find out what happened to them and have not been told. Some belong to people who have been dead for 80 years, and who will be named for the first time in an archival footnote that almost no one will read. The incompleteness of the record is not a permanent condition. It is a work in progress, but it is a work that moves slowly, against institutional resistance and the weight of time, and many of the people it concerns have been waiting longer than a human life for someone to find them in the dark, and finally bring their names into the light. Fact number 101. There is a final thing to be said about the spies who were never recognized, and it is this. Most of them knew, they knew when they volunteered or were recruited, that the work they were agreeing to do required invisibility as its primary condition. They knew that if they succeeded, their success would be absorbed into an outcome credited to armies and commanders and governments rather than to them. They knew that if they were captured, the organization that had sent them might not be able to acknowledge that they had ever existed. They accepted these terms, not naively, not without understanding what they meant, but because the alternative was to leave undone something they believed needed to be done. This is not a comfortable conclusion, because it can be used to justify the failure of recognition. They knew the terms after all. But knowing the terms in advance does not transform a debt into a gift. The agents who served in silence knew they would not be thanked. That knowledge does not relieve us of the obligation to thank them. Every name recovered from the archives, every story told, every specific act of courage acknowledged in its full particularity rather than dissolved into the general category of wartime heroism. Each of these is a partial payment on a debt that can never be fully settled because the people to whom it is owed are almost entirely gone. This series, these 101 quiet windows into the lives and work and silence of people who served without recognition, is an attempt at that payment. It is not enough. It is what we have. And it is offered, tonight, to the silence they kept so faithfully and for so long. There is a question that stays with you after spending time inside this subject, and it is not the kind of question that resolves easily into an answer. It is this: what does it cost a society to forget the people who protected it? Not to forget carelessly, the way you forget the name of someone you met briefly at a party, but to forget deliberately, structurally, by design, through the specific mechanisms of official secrecy, bureaucratic classification, and institutional self-protection that ensure not merely that certain information is withheld, but that certain people, the ones who did the most dangerous and most essential work, are absorbed into general categories of heroism that acknowledge everything and remember no one. The 101 facts in this series are not fundamentally about intelligence tradecraft or the mechanics of wartime deception, though they contain both. They are about a specific kind of human experience that the history of the Second World War has consistently failed to engage with honestly. The experience of people who agreed to become invisible and who were then never offered the chance to become visible again. Think about what invisibility actually meant in practice. It meant living under a name that was not your own, in a place where everyone around you could be the person who reported you, in conditions where a single slip of memory or a single betrayal by someone you trusted could end everything, not with the clarity of a soldier's death in the field, but in a basement interrogation room, alone, with no witnesses and no official acknowledgement that you had ever been there. It meant that the most important thing you would ever do in your life had to be the thing you could least speak about. It meant that the identity you had constructed, the cover story, the false biography, the performed self, was the only self you were permitted to present to the world until it was either exposed or retired, and the person underneath it could emerge back into daylight, carrying everything that had been accumulated in the dark. Most of the agents who survived the war managed this transition. They went home, they built lives, they raised families, they worked. Some of them found ways to speak, decades later, about what they had done, in the careful, selective language of people who had been trained to give away nothing and had never entirely lost that training. Some took their silence all the way to the end. Some found that the silence had become so habitual that breaking it would have felt not like liberation, but like a kind of loss, the loss of the last thing that still belonged entirely to them. And there are the ones who did not survive. The ones in the records with the stamp that reads no further record. The ones whose files contain a date of arrest and no entry after it. The ones who were executed at Dachau, at Ravensbrück, at Mauthausen, and at 100 other places whose names belong to the vocabulary of atrocity rather than the vocabulary of honor. They died in the service of a cause they believed in, under identities that were not their own, for organizations that could not officially claim them, in circumstances that their own governments could not fully acknowledge for decades without consequences they were not prepared to accept. What do we owe them? We owe them, at minimum, the refusal to reduce them to their operational function. They were not merely wireless operators or couriers or handlers or cutouts. They were specific people, with specific histories and specific fears and specific reasons for agreeing to do what they did. The school teacher from Lyon, the fisherman from the coast of Brittany, the Belgian railway worker, the Polish man who walked voluntarily into Auschwitz because someone needed to see what was happening there and report it to the world. These are not interchangeable figures in a general narrative of wartime heroism. They are irreducible individuals whose specific choices, made in specific moments of extreme pressure, had specific consequences that we are still living with. We owe them the truth about what happened to them, including the parts of that truth that are uncomfortable. The networks compromised by their own handlers' errors. The agents sent into missions already blown before they arrived. The warnings issued and not acted upon. The survivors abandoned by the organizations that had used them. The ones who signed secrecy agreements in the hours after the war ended and carried those agreements as a form of ongoing service to governments that in many cases did not return the loyalty. We owe them, perhaps most of all, the specific acknowledgement that the silence they maintained was not evidence of insignificance. The absence of documentation was not evidence that nothing happened. The missing names in the official records were not the absence of people. They were the specific form of service those people had been required to render. They had been asked to leave no trace. They obliged. That obligation has lasted long enough. It is time for the trace to be laid down, carefully, specifically, and with full seriousness, in the record of who this war was fought by, and what it cost, and who paid the cost, and whose names we have owed. For 80 years, the simple dignity of being spoken aloud, sleep well. The names are still being found, and every one of them matters.